You've probably heard of skill-based matchmaking, but have you heard the whispers of conspiracy? Skill and competitive integrity may no longer be enough for modern AAA competitive games, but is there truth underneath these whispers? Well, the answer isn't necessarily black and white, and it's almost impossible to discern accurate information about the underbelly of matchmaking. What if I told you that companies like Activision and NetEase Games, the studio behind Marvel Rivals, have extensively researched matchmaking and know exactly what keeps you playing? Or what if I told you NetEase's Fuji AI Lab, China's first professional game AI research institution, has a dedicated matchmaking research and development branch, and one of their conclusions resulted in placing you against bots in a strictly player versus player mode in Marvel Rivals without your knowledge or consent? Whether you're a competitive gamer or not, this case study contains many topics that I think are important to be aware of, so I hope you stick around and find value in this video. We'll be dissecting matchmaking, skill-based matchmaking, including the fundamental concept of flow, winnability, and win rates, Call of Duty's data on skill-based matchmaking, EA's research study on what they called engagement-optimized matchmaking, including match outcome analysis, Call of Duty's adaptation of optimizing player retention through matchmaking, Call of Duty's use of machine learning to increase player retention, several of Activision's patents, including giving advantages to the desperate/fatigued players, and driving microtransactions through matching players based on skins, and evidence of the system in their new generative AI. NetEase's OptMatch and InMatch research studies and systems, common match outcome patterns and their relation to win and lose streaks and gambling psychology, the relationship between retention, fairness, and perception, potential player state or performance alterations, though unlikely but still entertaining to briefly explore, bots in Marvel Rivals, and some brief topics such as role queue, anti-cheat, Black Ops 6's player drop-off, and other fun goodies. Now, before we build this case, let's lay some groundwork. First, I want to be clear about my goal for this video. I'll be outlining how modern AAA competitive titles seem to have strayed from fairness and competitive integrity. I want to be very clear that the takeaway from this video isn't that the game prevents you from improving or climbing a ranking system. This video isn't intended to boost egos or to provide excuses. No, my goal is to spread awareness of the manipulative tactics used by many AAA companies in an effort to tap into your emotions and keep you feeling the need to play. Second, I want to make you a promise. This video requires more logical deduction than my usual game design case studies. You may not want to believe some of what I've discovered. You might be tempted to call it conspiracy. My promise to you is that I'll be honest, I'll be reasonable, I'll be fair, and I'll lay out everything as clearly as I possibly can. If there's enough evidence to lead to reasonable takeaways, then I will do so. If there's not enough evidence, then I will outline the possible takeaways and caveats. A ton of research went into this case study, and I personally found it quite fascinating. I hope you'll find it as fascinating as I do. Now that we're all on the same page, let's begin. So what is skill-based matchmaking, and why is it important and incorporated into every competent competitive game? It's important to define skill-based matchmaking because people like to misrepresent what it is, particularly streamers and content creators who benefit from unbalanced matches so they can easily win and create clickbait content from it. Skill-based matchmaking is a system that groups players together based on their skill levels to create fair and balanced and therefore competitive matches. Fair, balanced matches can be distilled into what's called flow. Flow occurs from psychological engagement. We lose track of time and become immersed in and focused on the game. The game holds the player's attention. The concept of flow was coined and studied by a psychologist who I'll call Dr. C. Tracy Fullerton, game designer, professor, and author, explains Dr. C's study well. The psychologist set out to identify the elements of enjoyment by studying similarities of experience across many different tasks and types of people. What he found was surprising. Regardless of age, social class, or gender, the people he talked to described enjoyable activities in much the same way. The activities themselves spanned many different disciplines, including performing music, climbing rocks, painting, and playing games, but the words and concepts people used to describe their enjoyment of them were similar. In all these tasks, people mentioned certain conditions that made the activities pleasurable for them. Applied to games, here's a simple diagram to showcase flow that measures skill or ability against difficulty or challenge. If a task is far too challenging compared to the player's skill level, the player feels frustration and anxiety. If a task is too easy compared to the player's skill level, the player feels bored. The goal is to hit the middle, to ride the line. When the player performs near their skill limit without feeling overwhelmed, the player becomes engaged and experiences achievement and satisfaction. This engagement is what holds players' attention. So let's narrow the focus to competitive games. Simply put, in any given match, what happens when players of differing skills are placed together? Whether in 1 versus 1 or team-based games, one player or team of high skill faces a low challenge because they're against a low-skilled player or team, so they become bored. The other player or team of low skill faces a high challenge because they're against a high-skilled player or team, so they become frustrated. Even worse, there's virtually no opportunities to improve or learn. For the winning side, it's boring, mindless, and not enough challenge or gameplay to be able to practice or distill improvement from. For the losing side, it's frustrating and there's too much cognitive load to discern where and how improvements can be made. There's not enough available information and time engaged to form a reasonable mental model to base future gameplay and experimentation or learning from. According to Dr. C, flow occurs most often within activities that are goal-directed and bounded by rules that could not be done without the proper skill. Skills might be physical, mental, social, etc. For a person who does not have any of the skills a task requires, it is not challenging, but meaningless. For a person who has the skill but is not completely assured of the outcome, a task is challenging. This is particularly important to game design. Which leads us into another requirement of competitive games. Fair, equal-skilled matches are also important because each player must perceive a game or match as winnable. The match outcome must be uncertain. Each player must perceive a reasonable chance or possibility of winning. Believe it or not, this very crucial property of games, having a perceivably reasonable possibility of winning, isn't always evident in modern AAA competitive games. We'll come back to this very soon. But first, I want to touch on an important aspect of skill-based matchmaking so that we're on the same page and we dispel possible misunderstandings about 50% win rates. Because ideally you're always facing equal skilled opponents, your win rate will naturally drift around 50%. If you're winning half of the time and losing half of the time, then you're in your ideal balanced skill bracket where match outcomes are uncertain and winnable for either team. What happens if the game is unbalanced and doesn't try to pair you with equal skilled teammates and opponents? If you're always facing higher skilled opponents, your win rate will naturally decrease over time, way below 50%. If you're always facing lower skilled opponents, your win rate will naturally increase over time, way above 50%. We want to avoid both of these scenarios. Therefore, if your win rate is, for example, 80%, it means you're mostly stomping players below your skill level, and that quickly produces boring matches. Ideally, skill-based matchmaking wants to create balanced, fair matches, so it'll help you face players that better represent your actual skill level. Over an extended period of time, you'll naturally reach your skill level potential, which is represented by around a 50% win rate. There's a bit more to it, but that's a different video. In poorly executed competitive games, always hovering around a 50% win rate may cause players to feel like the game is a Sisyphean task, never ending against ever-increasing quality of opponents. However, naturally hovering around a 50% win rate is just how competitive matchmaking works and how it should work. I'm gonna go on a little tangent here because I think this is an important mindset to establish. It's easy to fall into an entitlement where just because a player invests more time into a competitive game, they deserve a much higher win rate. But win rates are not a true measure of improvement. Whenever you hear someone expecting a much higher win rate as a reward for their skill, what they're really saying is they think they are entitled to be placed in unbalanced matches where they ruin or diminish lesser skilled players' experiences. And that includes pro streamers who think pros who play more and are in higher skill brackets are somehow entitled to at least one nuke in Call of Duty, which, by the way, is 30 kills in a row without dying.
Like there's barely any pros with a nuke. I mean, make that make sense.
Players may want that power fantasy progression of always winning, or may want to occasionally mindlessly stomp their opponent, but that's against the spirit of competition and competitive integrity.
Somehow in my mid-30s, my skills are actually picking up. I'm aiming better, I'm getting faster somehow. And this also means that my enemies are picking up their skills a lot too. The people I'm fighting are noticeably better than the people I used to be fighting, and this can make my life pretty miserable when I'm doing challenges for camos or something, or especially when I'm doing a non-meta in-depth gun. If let's say I do like an assault rifle and I have some really good games and play well, and it's like, okay, now it's time to swap over and do the pistol guide or the shotgun guide or the tactical rifle or something, it's still matching me as if I were going to be using like the best weapons in the game, and it's miserable and I get slammed. Call of Duty is not a competitive shooter. In older Call of Duty games, when I would play, me and my friends would just kind of smash lobbies, and about every like 5th or 6th game, we'd get matched up against some people kind of like ourselves.
Listen, weapons should be balanced so high-skilled players aren't stuck using the same meta equipment, or different maps should encourage different playstyles for variety and to guide players to achieve Call of Duty's camo challenges. These are some of the conversations for designers to consider, so it's disingenuous for people to twist these weapon meta and camo challenge issues as a problem with skill-based matchmaking. If you notice, he mentioned mostly smashing lobbies in older Call of Duty games, but that's a one-sided benefit. Competitive games are not single-player games where players can explore their power fantasies. So, skill-based matchmaking creates a fair, balanced environment, which naturally causes win rates to hover around 50%, which means win rates aren't a good metric of improvement. The game has to refocus the player's attention to something resembling visual progress. That's why games will add overt ranking systems, so the player's attention is not on their win rate, but on their improvement through the ranking system. Now players see tangible improvement and a rating against other players. A ranking system also plays into one of the strengths of multiplayer games, which, as Richard Rouse III so eloquently puts it, instead of just winning or losing the game in private, through their social component, multiplayer games make each win and loss a public affair, and thus significantly more meaningful. The potential for bragging rights goes up tremendously for a multiplayer game since players now have someone to brag to, as does the potential for shame at a resounding defeat. In addition to some kind of ranking system, a well-designed competitive game will inherently provide the rewarding and engaging feeling of improving at the strategy of the game, so players feel tangible improvements and will want to continue playing. Overall, relatively balanced win rates are not indicative of a problem with skill-based matchmaking. Relatively balanced win rates is simply a natural property of successful matchmaking systems. Now, at this point, it's clear why, in theory, skill-based matchmaking is mandatory in competitive environments. However, I came across a fascinating white paper from the Call of Duty team on the role of skill in matchmaking. The paper provides data to reinforce the importance of balance or skill-based matchmaking. According to the paper, team balance is the first and most important reason to track skill. If we don't know how we expect players to perform in a match, then we can't provide a balanced in-match experience for players. This results in blowouts, which we know are not fun for players on the losing end. When skill is utilized in matchmaking, 80 to 90% of players experience better end-of-match placement, stick with the game longer, and quit matches less frequently. They also mention how balanced matches affect the long-term health of the game. Unbalanced matches would cause a feedback loop of low to average skill players continually leaving the game as the average skill of the population rises. Then, the new relatively lowest skilled players experience the negative outcomes, and the cycle repeats until the player base dies and new players can no longer approach the rising learning curve and skill floor. Now let's look at some data. In this graph, you can see how when two teams' skill levels match, each team has a 50% chance to win.
So good.
According to the Call of Duty team, we can see that win rates are significantly affected by small team skill differences. For instance, let's consider a lobby of 12 50th percentile players. If just one of those players was an 80th percentile player instead, that player's team would have a 70+% chance of winning. Wow, that's incredible. I certainly have newfound respect for how important solid matchmaking systems have to be. Next, in early 2024, they ran the deprioritized skill test in Modern Warfare 3. For 50% of the game's population, the team decreased skill as a factor in matchmaking. The other half of the population was left with the standard configuration. The results? They observed that the return in player rate was down significantly for 90% of players. Here's the graph that they provide. The least skilled players start from the left. As I mentioned before with the potential feedback loop of players leaving the game, this is a visual representation of those lower skilled players leaving, though if you notice, the less balanced matches affects the entire player base. Additionally, the next graph displays the quit rate, which is the likelihood for a player to quit throughout a match. The quit rate significantly increases across 80% of players. And while the top 10% are quitting less, they'll start quitting as well once the bottom players leave and the skill brackets shift. The next graph displays an increase in blowouts across the board, between 4% and 12%. A blowout is a one-sided match where one team stomps the other without a perceivable chance for the losing team to win, which, again, isn't satisfying or rewarding. They agree, saying, the goal is to make the outcome of a match as unpredictable as possible. This reduces the probability of blowouts occurring, which are known to negatively correlate with self-reported fun. Keep in mind, again, these results are just from a reduction in skill as a factor in matchmaking. Purely random matchmaking would amplify these numbers. They emphasize that in the paper as well. Based on our history of testing, completely removing skill from matchmaking would amplify the observed effects. This experiment is a repeat of a type of test that we have run at various times throughout the last 5 years, which means it's reproducible and predictable behavior. In the same paper, they mention running the same test in Modern Warfare 2019. And to emphasize again how the problem of unbalanced matches isn't just with lower skilled players, they ran a separate test to validate their findings. Subsequent attempts to protect only the bottom 25% of players and allow for looser matchmaking for the remaining 75% of players also had clear negative effects on player counts in 2 weeks, with increased quit rates and reductions in total hours played. Now, as a fun bonus, I want to point out their very brief mention of another test they ran, this time to tighten skill in Modern Warfare 3 as opposed to loosen. This had inverse results consistent with the results of the loosening test. Quit rate was down for 90% of players, and we saw other improvements in the experience of low-skilled players. However, we observed negative impacts for high-skilled players. As a result, this change was not rolled out. Unfortunately, they don't go into detail or show any data, instead opting for predictable PR wording, then a hypocritical statement of their goal being to make Call of Duty as enjoyable for as many players as we can. My gut instinct tells me that despite their test to create more balanced matches positively affecting 90% of the player base, they didn't want to negatively impact the players in the top 10% who I reasonably assume spend a lot of money on the game or represent pro players or otherwise heavy advocates or influencers of the game in the public view who represent the game's health and directly cause sales from casual players. They don't want to negatively impact their most dedicated players too much, hence the weird conflict in statements, the strange lack of data, and the sudden PR wording. There's no public data to support my theory, so take the reading between the lines as you will. However, attempting to balance how skill-based the matchmaking is actually lines up with the goal of maximizing player retention at the cost of fairness and competitive integrity, which will make a whole lot of sense later on. If you rewatch this video, you'll be like, oh wow, that's crazy foreshadowing. As a quick aside, the Call of Duty team released other white papers, such as how they handle ranked play, including their rank system like what I briefly mentioned earlier, but that's outside the scope of this video. If you're interested in learning more, I'll link the paper in the description, but also please comment below if you'd like to see future videos on the subject. Please include ranked play somewhere in your comment so I can see the interest more easily. And lastly, for skill-based matchmaking, here's a cursory overview of more studies that indicate the importance of balanced matches. But there might be a hint of something deeper to explore. These study results offer some practical choices and strategies for organizations that want to use serious games in work and for organizations that sell online games to consumers. To keep the players engaged in the game, they can be paired with competitors who exhibit similar skill levels. When game-playing activity is new to a participant, it is important to ensure that participants have enjoyment so that they will return to play, and as such, players can be paired with an opponent of lower skill level so that they enjoy and develop an intrinsic interest toward the game. Wait, hold up, are you telling me that there's more to matchmaking than creating balanced games? Quite intriguing. In another research study, they come to the conclusion that too high of a variance in skill gaps or large differences in opponents' skill levels increases churn, or the number of players who stop playing the game. Additionally, excessively unbalanced matches increases the churn probability, and frequently biased matches should be avoided. But at the same time, our results support that players prefer easier matches in a moderate range of a skill gap, and a short winning streak appears to provide positive experiences. Fascinatingly, low-level players tended to remain when their losing streak rates increased. Interesting. Let's move on for now. Overall, the best way to achieve flow in competitive games is through skill-based matchmaking by pairing players of similar skill levels, thereby creating a competitive environment that players perceive as fair and winnable and therefore engaging, reinforced by the data behind Call of Duty. That's not to say Call of Duty has a perfect matchmaking system, but the paper gives us a better understanding of skill-based matchmaking. However, in the modern era, AAA game companies began to realize that skill-based matchmaking can give players a bad experience, which is honestly not surprising. Even if matches are fair and balanced, many players don't like losing several matches in a row, for example. Enter Engagement Optimized Matchmaking, or EOMM for short. EOMM aims to maximize overall player engagement and claims that skill-based matchmaking is only a part of what keeps players engaged. Let's look at a research study published by EA in 2017 titled EOMM, an Engagement Optimized Matchmaking Framework. This paper is the basis of modern engagement-oriented matchmaking systems as opposed to skill-oriented systems, matchmaking that prioritizes player retention over fairness. That might sound crazy, but imagine if it was possible to increase the likelihood of players not quitting and instead buying from your stores. That's an easy yes, yes, yes. And anyone who understands how AAA companies operate would know that they would, in a heartbeat, decrease fairness and competitive integrity to achieve empirically higher retention. But don't just take my word for it. Current matchmaking systems depend on a single core strategy: create fair games at all times. These systems pair similarly skilled players on the assumption that a fair game is best player experience. We will demonstrate, however, that this intuitive assumption sometimes fails and that matchmaking based on fairness is not optimal for engagement. EA breaks EOMM down into three components: a skill model, a churn prediction model, and a graph matching model. A skill model is exactly as it sounds. Each player needs a skill rating to be ranked amongst the player base and to enable skill-based matchmaking. So how is that skill rating calculated? There are many options, the first dating back to 1952, but the specifics aren't important for our purposes. The second component is where we'll focus: a churn prediction model, or for our purposes, simply churn risk. Churn refers to no gameplay within a period of time, so the churn risk is the risk of the player's disengagement. EA provides data from one of their PvP games that show the average churn risk given the last 3 match outcomes. That is, the number of players who stop playing within a period of 7 days after their last match. This table is fascinating. Feel free to pause to take a look yourself and see what patterns you notice. First of all, let's split the table into 2 groups. Now it's easy to notice how the top churn risks of both groups may represent the result of flow not being reached. Constantly losing or constantly winning can cause players to feel frustrated or bored, or otherwise uninterested or disengaged. Of course, the quality of the matches matters as well. Players are more forgiving of winning or losing streaks if the matches are engaging by being a close outcome, challenging, and winnable. For our second and third observations, EA points out the double loss pattern. But if you notice, each outcome on the higher end of churn risk ends in a loss. Psychologically, both patterns make sense. There's a psychological bias called the peak end rule, and when applied to games, says that players judge an experience based on their feelings at its peak and at its end rather than as a whole. So if a player stops playing after a loss, they're more likely to apply a negative emotion to the overall experience of the session, and thus the churn risk increases. Additionally, there's a cognitive bias called loss aversion. Losses have twice as much impact psychologically as gains. Then mix in a player's potential ego, a potential propensity for or susceptibility to negative emotions from losing that often cause a decrease in gameplay performance, and the sunk cost fallacy that leads to a just one more game mentality. And it's no surprise how some players bounce off of a competitive game just from the volatile nature of player versus player environments, sometimes without fault of the game itself. So, what's the takeaway here? Different match outcomes clearly have at least some effect on players coming back to the game, which is obviously the goal, to keep players hooked and playing for as long as possible so they'll purchase more from the in-game store. So the fact that some patterns of match outcomes cause certain players to quit at a higher rate is a problem. EA proposes the following solution. Given possible game outcomes sampled from win, lose, and draw, if a draw for the next match would produce the lowest churn risk, that is, the player has the highest chance to continue playing if the next match is a draw, then EA claims the equal skill-based matchmaking is equivalent to EOMM, as both strive to form matches with draw outcomes as much as possible. A draw outcome here simply means a 50% chance to win from skill-based matchmaking. If a win or loss for the next match would produce the lowest churn risk, then EA claims equal skill-based matchmaking is actually worst among all matchmaking schemes, as its goal to create close matches contrarily minimizes the overall player engagement. In layman's terms, if the player has the highest chance to continue playing if they win their next match, then the game should rig the match so the player wins. If the player has the highest chance to continue playing if they lose their next match, then the game should rig the match so the player loses. I know this sounds insane, but think about it logically. If there's an optimal sequence of match outcomes for each player that would keep them playing, then the solution is to control future match outcomes as much as possible. Oh, little Timmy over here needs to win his next match, so he's more likely to keep playing and to engage with our store. So let's place Timmy against a lower skilled team, or let's place Timmy with a higher skilled team who can carry him. This is what Activision explored, as we'll soon see. No matter the method used, pure skill-based matchmaking and therefore fairness and integrity are no longer prevalent, and player agency becomes as minimal as the game can get away with. To reinforce the conclusion, let's look at EA's simulation to test EOMM's effectiveness. The input into the simulation includes the player's 10 most recent matches and a calculated predetermined upcoming match's outcome win, lose, draw. EA took this input and simulated it against 4 matchmaking methods. Worst matchmaking, which is supposedly the opposite of EOMM for validation purposes, skill-based matchmaking, random matchmaking, and EOMM, or engagement optimized matchmaking. For players who play 20 rounds of matchmaking games within 8 hours, there will be 15% more players retained by EOMM over those by skill-based matchmaking. Wow, that sounds significant. But remember, we talked about why skill-based matchmaking is so crucial for players, and now, typical of AAA companies, EOMM is plain and simple player manipulation through match outcome probabilities, where the more potent the manipulation is, the further away fairness and competitive integrity become. And guess what? The average player is not supposed to know about it. But now you do, and a surprising number of players at least feel that something is wrong in modern AAA competitive games. Which brings me to what I don't like about this study, and I don't just mean the obvious intent to manipulate match outcomes. First, the study was based on what they believe to be an accurate simulation rather than real-world testing, so it ignores any potential differences between the simulation and the real world. The study disregards how fair the player felt the match was, or if the match felt like a winnable or close match. And remember, by their own admission, a close match is the worst among all matchmaking schemes if the player's retention or churn risk demands a win or a loss. Which leads to the second and most important factor that this study disregards. What do you think happens when a real-world player finds out that they're even potentially being manipulated and the matches are essentially rigged and unfair? The study does not consider the real-world impact of the player's knowledge of these systems. And believe it or not, transparency between a studio and its player base is also incredibly important. So without transparency, players will feel even more uneasy and lied to.
It creates this feeling where nothing is authentic anymore. Everything feels artificial, and when you're doing too good for too long, the game inflates your rating to bring you back down to earth, and when you're doing poorly for too long, the game throws you a few bones to keep you playing. It's the very definition of engagement optimized matchmaking. They don't want you doing too well or too poorly all the time. This shit is so creepy. It's so manipulative, and like most of you, what it's caused me to feel is nothing but apathy. Like, did I do well? Cool, I probably got fed that lobby. Did I do bad? Oh well, for some reason, that lobby was a 400 skill rating lobby, so I wasn't expected to do well whatsoever.
So, if EOMM seems to be volatile, why use it? Why stray from satisfyingly close matches, fairness, balance, and competitive integrity? Well, as long as players don't find out or feel that something is wrong, then the data supports maximizing player retention through this matchmaking system. And it's not necessarily easy for players to find out, especially in the mobile marketplace where some variations of an EOMM system are most commonly used, though much more advanced than this EOMM paper suggests. Indeed, EA simulated testing may not account for players feeling manipulated or feeling like their matches are unfair, but the data still indicates that in an ideal environment, it's possible to optimize player engagement or retention, to hook players to keep them playing for as long as possible, and to increase profits. And as we'll explore later on, NetEase came to the same conclusion. So let's break this down logically. A competitive game wants to maximize and optimize a player's engagement or retention. That game's research indicates empirical data that fairness, competitive integrity, and equal skill matchmaking does not produce optimal results. It's important not to lose the nuance here. A game that desires to optimize retention cannot outright abandon fairness, skill-based matchmaking, and overall balance because the importance of balance is a fundamental principle of games. You see this thick boy? Yeah, it's called game balance. Maximizing retention still involves fairness, skill, and balance, but to what degree can matchmaking systems get away with sacrificing that fairness and integrity to optimize retention? The simplest example would be, a player plays fair matches against equal skilled opponents, but loses, then loses again and again and again. While the matches themselves may be satisfyingly close matches, the churn risk or the risk of the player quitting may begin to increase because of the losing streak. The player enjoys the balanced matches, but also wants to sometimes win. So what's the clear answer here? You may think, okay, maybe the player's skill isn't as high as we thought, so skill-based matchmaking will adjust the player's skill level to be more accurate, so the player should ideally have a fair, balanced chance of winning, 50%. But this is where we have to think rationally from the perspective of AAA companies. Even in a well-balanced match, there's a 50% chance that the player loses again. The game obviously cannot rely on a 50% chance when the consequence could be the worst possible scenario of the player churning or quitting the game. And keep in mind, AAA companies have the data to know when you're likely to quit. That's exactly what the EOMM paper did by analyzing churn risk, and later we'll see machine learning at play. A fair skill-based 50% chance to win or lose is simply unreliable and the risk is too great. So the logical conclusion is to decrease the churn risk and therefore increase the probability that the player wins their next match. As long as the player perceives the match as fair, EOMM can simply match players together in a way where the match outcome probability isn't 50%. It could attempt to be sneaky, like 55% or maybe even 60%, whichever probability increases player retention whilst the player still perceives the match as fair. Now, that example is just the tip of the iceberg. EA started a train. Let's take a deep look at Call of Duty's publisher, Activision. As part of a string of matchmaking patents starting from 2014, in 2019, Activision filed one titled Systems and Methods for Dynamically Weighing Match Variables to Better Tune Player Matches. Inside contains direct EOMM intentions. Section 16, if a player has been performing poorly, the scoring engine may match the player in a game that will improve the player's performance. For example, the player may be matched with easier opponents and/or matched with better teammates. That's pretty straightforward, but there's more. Section 98, if a given player has performed poorly during previous game sessions, scoring engine may make gameplay easier for the player. For example, if a player has been getting killed at a rate higher than the player's historical rate, scoring engine may match him with easier opponents, higher skilled collaborative team members, game sessions that are more suited to the player's gameplay style, for example a map that favors snipers, and/or other coefficients that can affect the outcome of a match score. The patent emphasizes the same match outcome manipulation later on. Section 142, if a player is determined to be on a losing streak within the past several gaming sessions, analytics and feedback engine may pit the player against lower skilled opponents and/or team the player up with higher skilled players to increase the chance that the player will win or otherwise perform better. This patent clearly at least explores rigging match outcomes, thereby veering away from skill-based matchmaking, which is difficult enough to enact as is. Remember, Activision's Call of Duty team admitted to how lopsided matches can be if even one player's skill level is too disparate. So it would be relatively easy to manipulate match outcome probabilities and then lie about how nobody of relatively equal skill level was available during matchmaking. Now, of course, just because the patent exists doesn't necessarily mean Activision implemented it into their systems. Companies sometimes file patents in order to prevent other companies from exploring the same methods. However, even if the patent did not exist, that doesn't mean Activision isn't incorporating EOMM type systems. But the patent does exist, so it's clear that they're at least exploring EOMM, and they wouldn't do that if they didn't intend on implementing these systems if they're empirically beneficial, which they are. Let's continue. Activision filed this patent in 2019, but they began to file matchmaking patents back in 2015, which were granted in 2019 or earlier. The dates line up with the Modern Warfare reboot in 2019 when the community felt something had changed.
You seem to be one of the more knowledgeable people in this community in terms of like how the game functions on the back end. Obviously, we're talking about Call of Duty today.
But I think Call of Duty is a very different game compared to other games. I think skill-based matchmaking, since Modern Warfare 2019, that's where things like immediately there was like a switch that they flipped, and yeah, it's something I no longer accept very much. Back in those days, I didn't do any like detailed testing with Advanced Warfare, so I agree something did feel different in that game compared to the others as well, but I still don't think that was the same type of system. I don't think that was so much engagement optimized matchmaking as more of a true skill-based matchmaking, but turned up from the previous games.
In 2019, again the magic number 2019, Activision held an AWS presentation discussing their use of machine learning for player engagement.
So for people that worked with live products, this curve is really familiar. So you have an early engagement building up, and there's a peak, and eventually there's a tail. Now, different people are going to have different shapes. Some people are going to have like a higher peak, lower peak, shorter tail, longer tail, but that's what the average curve looks like. Now, another way to look into this curve is, this is your Call of Duty journey. Every part in this curve is what you were doing at that specific time. So every point in this red line is your state in your journey.
Either as a new player to the game or even trying out a new feature, your engagement starts low and the game has to hook you somehow. The game must move you between states that increase your engagement to reach the peak, but also minimize how players' natural engagement or interest decreases over time. This is why live service games favor seasonal content, to provide more reasons for players to return.
Now, the way you achieve that is through reinforcement learning. Generally, you have like a reward state, which is the 1.0 on the top, and sometimes you have like a negative reward state, which for you could be the churn state. You want to avoid this state. We're trying to find the value of those other cells. Those other cells are specific states that exist in this world. You see that going up in different states have different returns. States for us is user attributes. So anything about engagement, revenue, preferred items, every circle you see in the screen, it's a state. So the axes are churn states. Remember, the arrows are the actions. It's how I walk from one state to the other. And messages are pretty much what we send to the user. You can see there's a path. I need to reroute user to state 2 and state 3. Now there's a risk. In state 2, the user can churn. You could churn from any state, actually. Now, how confident am I, the model, that I'm going to be able to avoid this state, and I'm going to make people go to state 3 in order to experience this feature? As long as I have a higher confidence, I'm going to do this rerouting. If I have a lower confidence, it's going to do something different.
Essentially, you exist in a state, and your current state has paths which could lead to churn, meaning the player quits the game and doesn't return, or could lead to other benefits or negatives. So the goal is to move you, as the player, to the most optimal states where your emotional and mental states are where they need to be in order to keep playing or to engage with the store, etc. But for each day, a player could have access to different paths or react differently, so Activision tries to compare you to other players similar to you.
We have people sharing states for a moment in time. So I can look at somebody that was in your state that you are right now, but this person was 6 months ago, and see what happened to this person. Did this person increase engagement, decrease engagement? What message this person was sent? And was it good, was it bad? Now I get all this information and I can make a decision about what to do with you right now.
And now let's look at their visual representation of states and their connections to potential good and bad future states.
This is the very center of the graph. We cannot fit all the hundreds of thousands of states here. The lighter the color is, the more engaged the user is with Call of Duty. The size of the circles there is how many people are in that specific state. So you can see already some patterns that some states are connected to some other states. And this is really powerful now because I can give a heads up before somebody goes to like a critical churn state 1 week before. You can run simulations to see where people are going to be 1 week from now, 1 month from now.
Yes, they know which possible states you can end up in, and they can predict what they need to do 1 week or 1 month from now. They know the most optimal way to keep you hooked on the game.
So in the very center, you see a larger circle, and this is the root state. When you start playing Call of Duty, that's where you start. It's really dark. Now, it's dark because you start a game, we don't know anything about you. So that's why it's a dark color there. But you see all those possible directions to go, all those possible paths, and where they send you to. Here you can see it's clear that there's like a cluster with light circles on the bottom. You want to reroute users there. So that's the strategy that the graph is going to do.
Now, clearly they're trying to control what the player does and sees as much as possible, and they track enough data of similar players to accurately estimate future states. Given what we know so far of EOMM and Activision, it's easy to see how they have their hands in every factor of their games to the greatest extent possible, and it'd be naive to think that they don't treat matchmaking the same since it's a core system, or core problem which determines the player's satisfaction. He later talks about how they managed the states with a heuristic algorithm called Monte Carlo tree search, where they explore the states that are most promising. Then they can simulate games and return the result. Indeed, they can simulate matches to predict the result and see how it'll affect the player based on past data of their massive user base.
We need to balance this exploration and exploitation.
Now, benefit of the doubt here, simulated matches isn't inherently bad. If you can simulate matches in a test environment with fake player data, you can test your matchmaking system to ensure it's accurate. And then you can accurately predict match outcomes and ensure you're as close to a fair 50% win-lose chance as possible. That's skill-based matchmaking. This machine learning is so much more. It tracks your current state and figures out the best future state with the least amount of churn risk. And since we know fairness and balance aren't the only factors in churn risk, they use their player data to lead players down the most optimal paths to keep them playing. And in a competitive game, matchmaking is essentially the core technology of the game. Now, let's logically apply what we've learned to common player patterns. Activision is analyzing player patterns to determine how to keep them playing. For example, a common psychological pattern that competitive players are well aware of is playing through a few matches that end in a loss, then you win a match, which feels great. Players keep playing through losing streaks to chase the high of a win, then often players continue to chase the high by playing after winning. However, for our example, let's say you log off of the game because you're satisfied with the session. Well, their machine learning notices and recognizes this pattern and tries to avoid placing you in a situation where you win, then quit for the day. So maybe the game routes you through an extended losing streak since that keeps you playing and hooked, chasing the high of a win. But then you get sick of losing and stop playing for the day. Or maybe if you lose only a couple times, then win, you'll keep playing instead of logging off. So their machine learning tracks how many losses it took for you to quit and adjusts the winning and losing streaks it will allow until they figure out the perfect number of wins and losses to keep you playing for as long as possible in each session. Spread these example patterns across a massive player base and their predictions become very accurate. As Activision said, they detect patterns and predict churn 1 week before or even 1 month from now.
So you can see already some patterns that some states are connected to some other states. And this is really powerful now because I can give a heads up before somebody goes to like a critical churn state 1 week before. You can run simulations to see where people are going to be 1 week from now, 1 month from now. You can run simulations to see where people are going to be 1 week from now, 1 month from now. I can give a heads up before somebody goes to like a critical churn state 1 week before. You can run simulations.
Or maybe you play the game most when you win, then after a loss or two, you quit. This tells the game that you're most likely to keep playing when you're performing well or winning. Obviously, this is a simplification, but as you can tell by now, this is an optimization problem. The highest impact solution for maximizing engagement potential is to manipulate match outcome probabilities by pairing certain players together and against one another without players perceiving harsh imbalances. And of course, EA's EOMM paper admits that it is indeed an optimization problem. Another common pattern or desire is to provide new players as good of an experience as possible, however the game can achieve that. Let's bring back a study I mentioned earlier. In 2013, from a study titled Digital Games and Beyond, What Happens When Players Compete, one of their practical choices and strategies for organizations that want to use serious games in work and for organizations that sell online games to consumers was, when gameplay and activity is new to a participant, it is important to ensure that participants have enjoyment so that they will return to play, and as such, players can be paired with an opponent of lower skill level so that they enjoy and develop an intrinsic interest toward the game. The goal is to get new players climbing the initial curve where they go from intrigued to fully engaged. Studios want to lead new players to the desired state where they purchase bundles and other goodies, and that's not going to happen if new players have a bad initial experience. What does this mean? Well, a massive company with a terrible track record like Activision clearly has the desire, capacity, and capability to optimize player states and player retention. I think you can put 2 and 2 together. If a new player performs well and feels good about themselves, they're much more likely to stick around to play more and purchase bundles. Heck, the new player experience is important regardless and has been considered by many old multiplayer titles. In an old deleted tweet that I had to dig up, Lee Perry, lead level designer of Gears of War 1 and senior gameplay designer of Gears of War 2 and 3, says, "In Gears, found out 90% of first-time players don't play a second multiplayer match if they don't get a kill. That first game's important." Context: Gears multiplayer is team-based, each match is only a few rounds and only 1 life per round. Once you're dead, you're out for the round. So each kill is significantly more meaningful than modern hero shooters. So we started you off with some major advantages, like additional damage bonuses, that tapered off with your first few kills. So competitive games have been helping out new players for a while now, and it makes sense to try and ease new players into a competitive environment. However, notice how the major advantages taper off after the first few kills. Even though it's clearly unfair to provide any player with a buff, at least the buff is brief and the new player is likely against players with a little bit more experience, assuming logically the availability of other new players during the exact moment of matchmaking isn't high enough. I could see this as a very brief necessary evil to at least consider if the game truly needs it. But notice how I'm treating even just a brief player imbalance with such trepidation. To be frank, I don't like his solution. Gears of War's multiplayer had a high skill floor to reach, and the single player campaign failed to set players up for the completely different multiplayer experience, and there wasn't any other method to ease players into multiplayer or to establish the correct player mindset and expectations for the multiplayer mode. Many competitive games choose to accomplish this through mandatory matches against AI before facing real players, as just one example. However, as important as the new player experience is, and it's a problem to plan for and solve for competitive games, it's very clear how modern AAA companies are exploring and implementing much more invasive and ever-present systems. There's a common pattern in particular that I want to point out just so you're aware, though if you're a competitive player in most modern AAA games, you may have noticed this already, or you may not have because it's player dependent. The pattern is, when you log into the game, you initially do well, potentially a short win streak, but then you transition to a lose streak, or at least some variation of extremes, of highs and lows that cycle over and over and over. And to clarify, highs and lows don't just mean wins and losses, but how much you won or lost by.
But one thing that I have noticed in my journey of re-education is that my games are wildly inconsistent. Some games I'm frying people and they almost don't even react. I'm feeling really good about myself. But then other games, they're basically time travelers. They're basically like playing pros, and I do have this experience. I've played professional players at a number of events over the years, and it's really weird to me when my lower skill matching lobbies have people that play or react just as fast as pro players. And I will say, this is a purely subjective feeling, is that I do feel like I'm being algorithmically screwed with. I feel that my experience is one of very high highs and very low lows.
Thankfully, there are people in the Call of Duty space who collect data in order to draw conclusions about how the games work. The Exclusive Ace is one of those people and a big name in the Call of Duty space. He speaks to the common pattern that I laid out.
The way that I see it, at least, and like this is based off my data, this is sort of my interpretation of it. It's not necessarily exactly how it is, but to me, it feels more like recently what they're using in Call of Duty is kind of like a slot machine algorithm where they're trying to control the highs and lows for you in the experience. So if you have a series of bad games, they're going to give you a good game. They're going to put you into an easy lobby, so then you can feel really good about that, and then you're going to be chasing that high over and over again, and it's a cycle that they try to maintain.
This interview was released around the time of Call of Duty Cold War and Vanguard. With the most recent release of Black Ops 6, the same data still applies, and we know this thanks to the EU. Activision now must provide personal privacy data on request, which includes skill-related data. The Exclusive Ace makes some interesting observations from players submitting their Black Ops 6 data to him, and it lines up with the streak patterns we've been talking about.
Another thing I've noticed is for some of the people that have shared their full grasp of their skill data, you often see a lot of roller coaster-like skill ratings, where it's just a constant cycle of ups and downs, and this seems to align with what many people have been sharing over the years that they experience while playing the game, and that is, you play really well for some games, then the next games you get into are significantly harder, so you perform way worse in those lobbies, and after you do that for a little while, now you're in easier lobbies and you get to perform really well again, and it's just that constant roller coaster-like effect.
Now, why does this pattern occur? Here we'll cover a bit of the psychology behind engagement-oriented systems. People who start a play session with a win become hooked and feel good, so they keep playing. They likely win 2 or 3 matches, but it's variable. A couple caveats that I feel I must emphasize: even though EOMM alters probabilities to be more one-sided, it may not alter if a draw is optimal or if the result doesn't matter. Also, individual player performance will always be a factor. Given a match where EOMM dictates there's an optimal path for retention purposes, it's still possible for players to break out of whatever EOMM provides. I say this as a reminder that a competent EOMM system is complex and not perceivable by players, and therefore not perfectly consistent or reliable. So, a win or win streak or whatever the system dictates hooks players or at least keeps them playing. But as we know, a continued win streak may cause boredom. After all, without the lows, the highs aren't as meaningful, and Activision's machine learning knows which pattern of highs and lows is optimal for you. And this is where we briefly venture into darker territory to help us understand highs and lows, or how win and lose streaks affect players. Why would retention optimized matchmaking systems utilize and study streaks or highs and lows? Firstly, intermittent reinforcement. In the original experience, the rat pushes the lever, then a pellet of food comes out. Continuous reinforcement is established because each lever push provides a reward. The rat knows it can rely on this action, so only pushes the lever when needed. When the pellets were removed, the rat eventually realizes it's not going to yield any pellets and loses interest. Continuous reinforcement. In the same way, if a player always loses, the player loses interest. But with intermittent reinforcement, behavior is rewarded randomly. When the rat pushes the lever, a pellet sometimes comes out and sometimes doesn't. The experiment predicted that the rat would become frustrated and eventually lose interest in the lever, but the opposite happened. The intermittent reinforcement created an addiction. This is exactly what occurs with gambling. The player is more likely to obsessively play through losing streaks, then once the player wins, the reward or high of the win actually becomes enhanced. Then the player seeks the high again and again, and is willing to continue through consecutive losing outcomes to reach the high. Secondly, reward reactivity. In the scientific study Reward Reactivity and Dark Flow in Slot Machine Gambling, in slots play, a post-reinforcement pause, or PRP, is the temporal duration between when an outcome, win or loss, is revealed and when the next spin is initiated. Multiple studies have shown that the duration of a PRP is significantly longer after a winning outcome compared to a losing outcome. In addition, studies have found that the greater the payout, the longer the PRP. The rationale used to explain this occurrence is that the momentary enjoyment of the reward temporarily inhibits the need for further reward seeking. Therefore, the larger the reward, the larger the enjoyment, and the greater the tendency to inhibit the reward seeking behavior. Remember when I described the great feeling of a win after a string of losses? The greater pause between the win and the next match played indicates basking in the win and the resultant enhanced enjoyment. The concept of intermittent reinforcement also applies here, since the string of losses enhances the next win or string of wins. Then after that great feeling, if it's late or the play session is long, players may stop playing until the next session. Every single competitive games player has said at least once, "Let's end our night on a win," and that's because it feels better to end on a high than a low. And yet, that doesn't paint the full picture. Even if the player ends the night on a win, the desire to continue playing and riding that high is present. If the player's session isn't near its end by external factors, that great feeling from the win provides excitement and a desire to keep playing and seeking more of those highs. The player will keep playing if possible. Another means of indexing the hedonic excitement associated with wins is to measure the force with which players initiate spins following various outcomes. Since wins elicit high levels of excitement-induced arousal, players will typically initiate the next spin with more force following a win than a loss. In 2 recent studies, we showed that the larger the win size, the greater the force applied to trigger the next spin. A good estimation of the larger the win size for our purposes would be individual player performance in the match. Here's another explanation of chasing highs. According to a nonprofit for gambling addiction, if you lose 5 games but then win 3 in a row, your brain wants to continue chasing the high of the reward. Many of these machines and games have human brains down to a science too, providing you with just enough irregular or intermittent reinforcement to keep you sitting at the table or spinning the wheel, but not enough so that you can actually turn a profit or recover your already lost funds. This is also called a variable ratio schedule, and it's the same way mobile games hook young adults into microtransactions. Additionally, we can look at a study on another competitive game with matchmaking. The scientific study, Impacts of Matchmaking and Performance on Churn in a Competitive Game, reached multiple fascinating conclusions that reinforce the effect of streaks, including 1. More frequent and consecutive wins increase user retention. 2. The streak in another study averaged over 10 consecutive wins or losses, which is considerably longer than the average of 5 wins or losses observed in our data. Combining these findings, we concluded that a short winning streak appears to provide positive experiences, but might become a negative experience when players undergo an inordinately long streak. 3. The results also reveal that consecutive losses can affect churn differently depending on the player's level. Low-level players tended to remain when their losing streak rates increased. To be clear, even without these sources in this data, the rationale behind maximizing player retention makes sense. For each individual player, a system can determine a player's patterns and which player archetype they fall under, then apply data-backed heuristics to push them to the correct states. This is what Activision has built. So if their archetypes, data, heuristics, whatever, determines that a player is likely to churn if they lose a certain number of times, win a certain number of times, or some complicated pattern, then it's logical for Activision to act on that information from the perspective of AAA executives. Though I think looking at some of the psychology and research studies certainly helps paint a clearer picture of how winning and losing streaks, or highs and lows, can affect players. I think this comment summarizes the takeaway quite well. Engagement optimized matchmaking works by tricking and manipulating basic human reward structures the same way a slot machine works, mathematically screwing around with positive and negative stimulus to create a rough profile of how long you will or will not stay on a game based on your win-loss ratio. Why do people keep playing when they get stomped? Because EOMM already knows they will not quit after a stomp. They will keep playing to prove something to themselves and sink more time into the game, and right on the last match before they decide to quit, EOMM will give them a win. Keep in mind, the creative profile doesn't only consider your win-loss ratio. NetEase engineered a more advanced system for Marvel Rivals. We'll get to that. Now, if you notice, the change from a win streak to a lose streak can possibly be explained as a poorly implemented skill-based matchmaking system that consistently overcorrects and overreacts. I say this just to give the benefit of the doubt and to add the caveat that nothing can ever be 100% proven because we don't have access to Activision's servers. Does it make sense that the matchmaking acts so erratically and consistently bounces to extremes when Activision has infinite player data, reliable machine learning and algorithms, and released 8 games since players first felt EOMM introduced? No, it doesn't make sense, but I hope to still provide benefit of the doubt and context on this channel as much as I can, so it's still worth mentioning that we technically don't have access to any servers from the modern AAA companies that incorporate some variation of engagement optimized type systems. On the other hand, a matchmaking system that seemingly overcorrects and overreacts, or more specifically seemingly hits you with manufactured highs and lows, likely isn't purely skill-based matchmaking. What you should understand is skill-based matchmaking doesn't vary between extremes of highs and lows. It mostly adjusts skill levels more reliably over a period of time based on many skill-related factors as opposed to a ping-pong effect based on recent performance. Obviously, I can't show everyone's experiences, but here's another good summary. Those of us who have played hours and hours since Modern Warfare 2019 know that there's something fishy up. You get a couple of easier games, usually at the start, then the hammer comes down and you get wrecked for a bunch of games, then the roller coaster continues. Just when you get too many bad games, suddenly it goes back the other way and you start getting on big streaks. That's not matching my skill, that is artificially giving me a bunch of highs and lows. There's no way my skill starts out high and then I suddenly start to suck at the game after a couple of games. It is too consistent to not be a thing. I don't buy that it is just reading too much into recent performance. I've played games where they try and keep people relatively on the same playing field, usually no more than 1 rank away. I play those games and they don't play like Call of Duty. I rarely feel like I am in a lobby that matches my skill. Either I'm wrecking or getting wrecked. Skill-based matchmaking may heavily factor recent performance if it detects a type of cheating called smurfing, definition on screen. But even then, skill-based matchmaking's goal isn't to ping-pong the player between highs and lows. That's the job of advanced algorithms and machine learning attempting to increase retention. But again, the distinction can be difficult to discern. A well-crafted engagement-optimized system should still lead players to perceive that they're experiencing normal and fair wins and losses. And in fact, the system will still offer fair matches when it's optimal. From there, many players will become lost in the conversation because it requires so much research and nuance, and player performance and skill are still factors that muddy the water. Which leads me to how players may feel that something is wrong with the matchmaking, but the truth isn't easily accessible without some digging. Heck, for this video, I read through, and I mean actually read through, many patents, white papers, and research studies, and somehow found and documented Activision's engagement talk that has only 4,000 views. I had to dig one interview up from the grave since the channel suddenly switched to a different focus and deleted all their videos. Of course, the research for this video extends far beyond these examples, and if you appreciate and find value in these sources and the unique content on this channel, I'd love to see you stick around. I greatly appreciate your viewership. A channel like this doesn't survive without direct support from you, and I sincerely hope this case study sheds light on otherwise difficult topics. But the point is, due to all the research involved, the average player won't know what's really going on if they feel their matches aren't quite balanced. Or, ideally for EOMM or related systems, these manipulative systems really don't want players to know they're being manipulated in the first place. Or if players do feel possibly manipulated, then the deceptive system desires to create just enough doubt for people to call it a conspiracy. And it certainly doesn't help that false conspiracies muddy the waters as well, such as skill-based damage, which we'll talk about later. And that's the point. Engagement-oriented matchmaking systems increase retention but decrease fairness or balance and integrity. So if players perceive that decrease in fairness and integrity, what do you think happens? The system cannot allow the player to feel or perceive that the game's fairness and integrity was compromised. Therefore, the introduction of deceptive retention optimization also introduces the requirement to deceive the player's perception of the game's fairness and integrity. In other words, the ideal system will attempt to increase retention through deceptive means, whilst maintaining the player's positive perception of the game through deceptive means. Frankly, it's volatile to rely so much on anti-player deception. It's a dangerous game to play, but a necessary one in the eyes of the typical AAA company whose executives aren't player first and rely on short-term gain instead of long-term. Revisiting the scientific study, Impacts of Matchmaking and Performance on Churn in a Competitive Game, some of the conclusions further indicate the tightrope walking of a retention-optimized system. 1. Being matched with weaker opponents decreases the possibility of churn more than fair matches, being matched with equally skilled opponents. Our results support that players prefer easier matches in a moderate range of a skill gap. 2. At the same time, too high of a variance in skill gaps or large differences in opponents' skill levels increases churn. 3. More frequent and consecutive wins increase user retention. 4. We concluded that a short winning streak appears to provide positive experiences, but might become a negative experience when players undergo an inordinately long streak. 5. The win rate affected the advanced players more than the beginners. The beginners appeared to be less concerned about achieving low win rates. The win rate became important when the players were accustomed to the game. An earlier study showed partially similar conclusions. Analyzing an MMORPG, the study demonstrated that achievement affected churn more as players raised their levels. 6. The results also reveal that consecutive losses can affect churn differently dependent on the player's level. Low-level players tended to remain when their losing streak rates increased. 7. Additionally, low-level players may be more sensitive to the frequency of losing streaks than to their length. 8. Players value their win rates and win streaks over other factors, though this may not be an exact effect. But it's still worth noting how much more winning streak matches was a meaningful factor on player retention data, like what EOMM measures, compared to average skill gap, variance in skill gap, and losing streak rate. 9. It is worth avoiding excessively unbalanced matches. A 50-point increase in the average skill gap can increase the churn probability by 10%. If a player with a churn probability of 17% undergoes such an experience, the player's churn probability will increase to 18.7%. It might seem like a small change, but for massive multiplayer games, even a 1.7% point increase in churn rate can be critical. 10. Frequently biased matches should be avoided because a 30% point decrease in the win rate will result in an almost 1% point increase in the churn rate. So as you can see, there continues to be additional evidence as to how winning and losing affects players, but also excessively unbalanced matches and frequently biased matches can be a problem. There's clear value in knowing when and by how much to influence factors that lead to higher retention without being excessive or frequently biased. It's important to note that the study refers to another study for the theory that both winning and losing streaks negatively impact players in online games. The other research study for the anecdotal data is titled Playing with Streakiness in Online Games: How Players Perceive and React to Winning and Losing Streaks in League of Legends. The study finds that players perceive streakiness as a whole in a negative light. However, this is a qualitative study. The study simply looks at anecdotal player perception gathered from forums, doesn't differentiate winning and losing streaks, and doesn't look at quantitative measures of player retention. Also, the streak that the participants mentioned in their study averaged over 10 consecutive wins or losses, which is on the extreme end. So their findings further reinforce how player perception matters, but the empirical data from quantitative studies shows how player retention increases from engagement-oriented optimizations through matchmaking. So indeed, measurements of player retention data and anecdotal player perception don't always line up, which means a balance must be struck for games that desire to increase retention by any means necessary through their matchmaking. If games want to use deception to optimize retention in their matchmaking without players knowing something is wrong, their deception must also be used to manipulate the player's perception. But what if players do feel deceived or manipulated? As I mentioned, even if players feel manipulated, they likely won't know what's really going on because it's easy to think that the game just sucks in some undeterminable way, or the servers suck, or the mechanics suck, or players create actual conspiracies that still hurt the game but aren't true, or even skill-based matchmaking sucks. Indeed, so many people online have this misconception that skill-based matchmaking ruins games, and I want to briefly address the reasoning behind it. For one, as I've already stated, it's not easy to 100% prove what's going on behind the scenes, and the matchmaking system is obscured. But players may feel that something is wrong and become frustrated, so they blame the easy scapegoat, skill-based matchmaking, because they just don't know any better. Secondly, EOMM can be thought of as built on top of skill-based matchmaking, and both still rely on calculating player skill, so it's easy to blame skill-based matchmaking. Thirdly, matches may just be unbalanced if a game doesn't implement skill-based matchmaking well, or if there aren't enough players, which could reinforce people's preconceived notions of skill-based matchmaking ruining their games. Fourthly, public figures like streamers and content creators are the ones primarily propagating the skill-based matchmaking is bad narrative, and they are the only ones who benefit from that narrative. Without skill-based matchmaking, higher skilled players have a higher chance of stomping matches and ruining the game for lower skilled players. But the imbalance allows for easier content creation. What a crazy coincidence! I think the exclusive ace explains the misconception very well.
A common misconception on the other side of things, and this is due to how it's labeled, skill-based matchmaking, is this really isn't a true skill-based matchmaking system. A true skill-based matchmaking system would give you an ELO score, and it would matchmake based on that ELO score. And generally, an ELO rank won't be significantly swinging from game to game like it can in Cold War. So since this is so heavily based on your recent performance rather than your actual skill level, this really technically isn't skill-based matchmaking. It's the most commonly accepted term and the most commonly searched for term, so that's why we use it in our titles and we refer to it as skill-based matchmaking. But in reality, this is more of an engagement-optimized or retention-based matchmaking system. It's not designed just to be fair to players to make sure they're playing with people of the similar skill level. What it's designed to do is keep you playing for as long as possible. So it gives you the highs, it gives you the lows, and it does this in a very cyclical manner for many of the players in the community. With a true skill-based matchmaking system, you wouldn't see these massive swings from lobby to lobby. You would see progression in the difficulty over time. And that's not what this system appears to be based on the data.
The bottom line is that the matchmaking feels consistently unfair from a failure to manage player perception, and yet players understandably don't read all the research studies, so we see community outrage at the scapegoat of skill-based matchmaking that looks like the following.
So I think it's time that skill-based matchmaking goes the way of the dodo, but Activision won't hear that. They're either too stupid or too stubborn. When the community moves on to COD 2025, Black Ops 6 at that point will be finished. The hackers will move on and skill-based matchmaking will go away because there won't be enough people playing the game for Activision to design lobbies with the sole intent of fucking you. Activision has this idea that pushing away 66% of their player base thanks to their matchmaking and lack of anti-cheat is good for player retention somehow.
And yes, Black Ops 6 lost their player base soon after launch. From Steam, we see a huge spike when Black Ops 6 released, then an astounding drop-off. In fact, the game dropped off so hard that Google refused to tell me Black Ops 6's release date, telling me to go play Killing Floor 3 instead. I couldn't believe this. And this is the point where I reached out to the studio behind Killing Floor 3 for the perfect sponsor opportunity for obvious reasons. However, I soon found out that instead of combining the best aspects from the first two games, which is all the player base wanted by the way, so the third game was supposedly on a silver platter for them, I guess they decided to create the most generic Unreal Engine game with a strange stock gray color palette and almost none of the features and game feel that players loved about the franchise. I have high standards for recommending products to you all, so let's forget about this game and move on. What's hilarious about the harsh drop of Call of Duty's player count is that Activision attempts to salvage the loss with an entire free week, which is unprecedented for modern Call of Duty according to Steam, and I believe Call of Duty has only offered free weekends in the history of Call of Duty. But the free week doesn't even work. Keep in mind, the player base numbers are even worse than you'd think since Activision purposely lumps their modern Call of Duty titles together, including Warzone, which is also bleeding players from its current state. I guess they invested so much into their new machine learning and matchmaking algorithms that they forgot to develop a good game. Whoops.
They added a lot of amazing things like Omni movement, but then they slowed so many things down to make it feel clunky, and then unnecessary changes like ammo boxes and getting rid of default perks, and fortunately they've reverted a lot of that, but it's getting to the point where like I don't even feel like the developers are listening to anything we have to say, and they don't listen to any of these changes until after the community tries it, agrees with me, hates the game, and we lose the player base. And the same thing happened again this year. I promise you, we have been beating our heads against the wall for 5 years. I don't know what the hell they're doing with the game, and almost every change they have made has been a direct contrast to what we want. I see this narrative all the time that they listen to pros, that they listen to sweaty creators. They don't. Oh my God, they do not. And I was in person in DC like, what the hell are you doing? This is going to go horribly. And it did.
I went off topic a little bit because I was shocked by a mainstream player base standing up for themselves for once, but I also like sharing what I find fascinating, so I hope you found it interesting as well. Now, is it possible to beat this EOMM system in machine learning? Well, let's think about this logically. The machine learning learns what's optimal for maintaining each player's engagement, and the worst possible state is for the player to quit. So let's say a player plays well and wins several matches, but then EOMM attempts to increase the probability of losing. After 1 or 2 losses, let's say the player quits. When the player returns, the probability of winning is higher than losing. Again, player performance still matters, and this is where I stop because I don't want people to avoid accountability or to think this is somehow a shortcut or a reliable loophole. If you suck at the game, nothing but improvement will help you, even though EOMM makes learning relatively more difficult. Maybe this is where we all pause to consider whether we want to support games that stray from fairness and competitive integrity so you no longer earn your wins and you no longer deserve your losses. There are literally a million better games out there.
I don't think there are many that have this style of engagement optimized matchmaking to this extreme. I think a lot of people can accept, especially more competitive shooter with less skill gap reducing elements in it, or shooters that have true skill-based matchmaking where it's actually based on more of a long-term skill ranking, so you get more of a smoothing effect over time. You're not seeing such a massive discrepancy from lobby to lobby. And I think people are more willing to accept that compared to COD's current system where it seems like they're getting thrown all over the place. I'm worried long term for the franchise. I think they're more focused on short term. I don't think they're really looking at these algorithms and thinking super long term. I think they're thinking short term because that's what corporations tend to do. It's quarterly earnings.
Okay, so far we've discussed skill-based matchmaking, flow, winnability or uncertain outcomes, win rates, the Call of Duty team's matchmaking white paper, EOMM and EA study, how EOMM is used, why EOMM is used, Activision's EOMM patent and machine learning, player and match outcome patterns, the relationship between EOMM fairness and the perception of fairness, chasing highs and lows or streakiness, gambling psychology, the new player experience, Call of Duty's player drop-off and skill rating data analysis, caveats to consider, and other research studies and subtopics where appropriate. Don't say I don't feed you well. Now let's explore a bit deeper past match outcome manipulation into a couple different optimization avenues. For our first avenue, individual player performance manipulation, let's zoom in on a second patent. Activision filed a patent in 2017 titled Methods and Systems for Incentivizing Team Cooperation in Multiplayer Gaming Environments. On the surface, the problem space makes sense. According to the abstract, the patent's goal is to allow players of different skill levels to concurrently play the same level of a gaming session, to encourage and incentivize cooperative team behavior, to match players based on subjective variables such as likability and a general fun factor, and to tailor gaming content based on the social group itself. In the lens of a purely cooperative PvE game, the potential problem to solve is how to create an engaging experience for every player on the team if they're a group of differing skill levels. If you remember Flow, differing skill levels against the same challenge won't create the same experience for each player, and Activision understands this. There is thus a need for a gaming environment that enables players of different skill levels to play together, while still providing players at the various different skill levels the appropriate amount of challenge for their given skill level, thereby avoiding having lower skilled players be overwhelmed or higher skilled players be bored. The obvious answer is, again, skill-based matchmaking. Ideally, everyone working together in a cooperative PvE game is of relatively equal skill level so everyone feels like they're contributing and no one feels bored or frustrated. On the other hand, for instance, if one player of higher skill level easily completes each cooperative challenge on their own, then everyone ends up bored with no meaningful gameplay to engage with. However, what if the game's player pool isn't large enough to support evenly skilled cooperative play? Or what if you're cooperating in a group of friends with different skill levels? These are worst case scenarios that can only be mitigated to a degree, so for some games they don't allow you to play with friends who are too different of a rank than you, and that makes sense because if the skill disparity in a lobby is too high for any given player, the entire lobby suffers. Activision's proposed solution is to acquire skill level data of each player, modify one or more parameters of the game session, then enable the modifications for each player. As an example, for individual players in a group who are a higher threat to the enemy AI, it makes sense for the AI to have a relatively higher likelihood of targeting the higher skill level players. Crucially, it makes sense logically, tactically, and narratively, and provides a slight natural difficulty adjustment as a bonus. However, trouble can arise when some players on a cooperative team feel handicapped without express permission or transparency. So let's look at Activision's proposed options for modifiable parameters. Between high, medium, and low skill levels, they suggest modifying the degree of accuracy required to hit a target, likelihood of being targeted by enemy, as we discussed, difficulty of an in-game puzzle, and so on. I'll put notes on screen for my initial thoughts on a couple of these, but I don't want to deviate too much. And of course, these are just examples. There are other possible modifications. Session modifications may include, but are not limited to, player adjustments, which may include the player's health, damage, speed, available abilities, and difficulty level. So some of you may already be reading between the lines for poor old Timmy. Clearly, this patent and these modifications aren't solely for cooperative or PvE games. Activision initially created this patent with first-person shooters in mind and attached an image of Overwatch when describing how they measure cooperative actions that influence matchmaking. We'll come back to this. Activision even outlines their outward intent. Individuals can form partnerships and participate in play against the system and/or against another team of individuals, thereby allowing for either cooperative or competitive play. The player may engage in a gameplay session in which he or she is matched based on skill with other players to play together on the same team or as opponents. Of course, just like the previous patent, the existence of this patent doesn't necessarily mean any of this is in effect. However, even the absence of this patent wouldn't mean Activision isn't attempting to incorporate their own technology. The existence of the patent at least guarantees that they went to great lengths to strategize methodologies for manipulating team-based games, whether cooperative PvE games or competitive PvP matches, which partially lines up with EOMM. And for our purposes particularly, keep in mind, in a first shooter gaming environment, when a first player aims his weapon at a target, a parameter defining the tolerance for how accurate the player's aim must be to hit the target is modified based on the acquired skill level of the player. A player having a higher skill level will have to be more accurate in aiming in order to hit the target. A player having a lower skill level will be assigned a higher tolerance parameter and therefore could be less accurate in aiming in order to hit the target. This accuracy and even damage manipulation leads down a rabbit hole. Oh my gosh. I'm going to rapid fire through some of the potential alterations that could theoretically happen to players. I'm not going to dwell on any single one because the evidence is ultimately lacking and I don't want to mislead you. But there's a lot here that's fascinating and it's good to be informed. First of all, it's basically impossible to 100% prove direct alterations to the player's state or performance, such as damage and health, but particularly aim accuracy and hitbox sizes. There's the netcode, so people can easily chalk it up to desync between the players and the servers. There's each player's aim or skill, so people can easily chalk it up to someone being inaccurate or coping. There are damage drop-offs for weapons, which apparently damage drop-offs in the newly released Call of Duty Black Ops 6 are more unintuitive and erratic than ever. I'll let the Tactical Brit explain for me by comparing two Call of Duty games, and I'll overlay stuff on top to aid in his explanation.
This is a chart of the TTK of every single SMG in Black Ops 6. And next to it is a chart of every single SMG in something like Modern Warfare 3. And there's kind of a big difference here. And the big difference is the amount of plateauing allowed before damage range jumps. So in Black Ops 6, the difference between you doing 225 time to kill and 300 time to kill with something like the KSV is the difference between going from 10 meters to 11 meters. We're talking about an 80 millisecond jump in TTK, which is a visible jump to some extent, in the space of less than a meter. And this step ladders over and over again across a fairly short distance. You know, we're talking about damage changing effectively across the board in the space of 10 meters 3 or 4 different times. That's a really big deal. When you compare that to something like Modern Warfare 3, the damage range jumps, and then there's a fairly lengthy plateau of a good couple of meters, and then it jumps again, and then there's a plateau, and then it jumps again. Whereas in Black Ops 6, you're seeing this constant overlapping of different damage ranges that's changing very frequently in quite sharp instances. You have this general new kind of damage range system that seems to zigzag a lot more than the previous one and doesn't have that sort of length of range. You get a system that can create a lot of inconsistency under the right conditions.
So as you can see, it's much harder to judge how far away you should stand from opponents in order to achieve desired damage values. In previous games, it's easier to estimate and learn distance ranges from experience, but that's much less likely in Black Ops 6. And that leads to a huge conspiracy community centered around what they call skill-based damage. Essentially, if an engagement optimization system determines that a higher skilled player is playing too well and needs to be nerfed during a match, To equalize the playing field, for instance, then the game will nerf the higher skilled player's damage during the match. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Activision stooped to that level. For example, we already know that EOMM and Activision want new players to have the best experience possible to climb the initial interest curve so new players continue to play the game for the long term. So hypothetically, the game could try to protect the new player's experience by nerfing damage that comes into contact with the new player. On the other hand, it'd be dumb for Activision to alter damage values because damage is an easier statistic to measure. And also, I haven't been able to find definitive evidence of skill-based damage from my research. The most likely explanations are, for one, given how Black Ops 6's damage ranges more frequently jump and are more constrained than previous Call of Duty titles, it's no surprise that players find the game's learning curve more unintuitive and frustrating. For two, there's a massive hit registration problem that's apparently been an issue in every modern Call of Duty game, and it's only gotten worse. So no wonder skill-based damage is such a prominent notion in the community when shots don't register. For three, the netcode is also terrible, and I'll show you several tests to showcase the issues very soon. So, I tried to be as fair as possible. We can't say that Call of Duty modifies damage mid-match, but what about other possible engagement optimization factors, like hit registration? Well, as I said, the hit registration is a surprisingly bad issue, the most prominent being the latest Black Ops 6 and Warzone. What's fascinating is that these hit registration problems even occur in Warzone's firing range. The splatter will occur, but the hit won't register.
Something seriously wrong with this game. 2 ghost shots. You could see the blood splatter both times I shot him and no hit marker or damage was being done. Boom. Shot number 1. Shot number 2. You see the blood splatter, which means he hit the shot. There is a hit marker difference. When you hit somebody in the head and you hit somebody in the body, there is a hit marker difference. It's a little bit subtle, but I'll show it to you right here. I don't think one time does he shoot to the head. Toes, 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 body, body, body. And when you see a hit marker like this, you see this hit marker with like the double lined hit marker? That is a headshot hit marker. Nothing but toe shots. Bro, not even hitting him here. Literally not hitting him here. These are headshot hit markers, Chad. These are headshot hit markers. Headshot, headshot, headshot. So headshot, headshot. Obviously on... Look, that's not a headshot hit marker right there. That is a regular, normal hit marker. Headshot, headshot, headshot.
There's no hit marker despite there being a blood splatter. But sniper hit reg has been a weird thing since COD 4. This one, again, we are seeing blood splatter and absolutely no hit markers. It takes this guy 20 shots, pretty much, to the head, and he's getting hit markers, blood splatter, the works. To kill this guy, this stuff just doesn't make sense. He doesn't start getting hit markers until the dude is like around the corner and he's shooting him through the wall. It appears, by the way, that the enemy also isn't really getting hit markers on the person shooting.
There are a million examples, but that's enough for our purposes. And the Call of Duty team had the most unhinged response to the issue, which is funny, but it's unrelated to our topic, so I'll add it as a bonus to the end of the video. I personally think this issue is way too obvious and pervasive to be engagement optimization to protect players' experiences. In fact, I somehow found a very interesting interview with a cheat developer, and he says Activision hosts way too much on their servers, though I suspect the hit registration problems run even deeper.
They host multiple servers, like for example like BO6, they host like the older games as well on the same servers, but they just run it through different ports. But their storage is insane on the servers. They must be paying a lot for it, because I don't know if you know about like any like BO3 situation, but we have full control over like their dedicated servers for a couple of the older CODs, and they had like a petabyte of storage on like this random server one time, and it was just full with like different games, like different game servers, like BO2, BO3. They had like World War II servers on there, BO4 servers on there as well. It was crazy.
And the hit registration problems do indeed run deeper. The Tactical Brit ran some tests in private lobbies to see how a billion-dollar franchise doesn't compensate for known issues to account for when developing a multiplayer game. I'll briefly step through each test since each one brings to light an interesting topic, and hopefully we can start to appreciate games that really nail these multiplayer considerations. First, he tested hit registration against high-speed targets.
We had 10 instances of a character sprinting and tactical sprinting across a door. Once the character was moving at high velocity and tac sprinting, on 3 of the 10 occasions, we had no hit registration at all, and that is in ideal network scenarios.
A 30% chance for a hit to not register against high-speed targets in ideal network scenarios sounds insane. In worst networking condition, he reports that 6 of the 10 tests resulted in no hit registration instead of 3. Secondly, he tested hit registration on several player models and found that missing a target can result in a hit on every model.
There are a number of locations on pretty much every character model I tested where shooting around the character model resulted in them getting a hit marker when they shouldn't. There are a couple of locations around the hips of the opponent, around the feet, around the legs, and that means when you factor in things like character movement and people zipping around the screen at the speed of light, there are going to be multiple hundreds, thousands, if not millions of instances of players receiving damage even though somebody missed.
Thirdly, he checked how Call of Duty deals with lag compensation.
But the problem, and this is arguably the biggest issue with Call of Duty, is that it always favors the shooter in terms of lag compensation. So there are times where if you're firing in a straight line and somebody moves across the door, or you happen to hit an opponent who is somebody who is on a good connection, they're going to receive damage around the corner.
Which means that the shooter's triggered hit markers are significantly delayed, and the person receiving the damage receives it when they're not being shot at. To be clear, these shots in the testing are hit scan, not projectiles, so the delay is significant.
This entire system favors whoever's firing, and that is not great. Many other games in the past, like Battlefield, had instances where they favored the shooter in networking-based scenarios where ping got tricky, and then completely changed that system so that people with good connections were prioritized. And Call of Duty absolutely needs to be the same. They need to change how lag compensation works, and they need to stop it where players are receiving damage around corners.
Fourthly, he checked desynced third-person animations.
So what I've found a lot of in Black Ops 6 is that it looks like an opponent either isn't looking at me, isn't aiming down sight, but suddenly I start receiving damage. You would see just straight up complete mismatches, where their gun is sideways and they'd be firing their weapon and you would start receiving damage. It looks like they're not even in any kind of shooting position to fire on you, and the game decides, okay, sorry, that animation isn't synced, you're going to receive damage before we've synced that animation server-side. So in pretty much any scenario where either the person shooting or the person receiving damage has a bad connection, you're going to have a complete desync in third-person animations. And if both players have a slightly questionable Wi-Fi connection with somewhat fluctuating latency, both of you are going to receive some of the worst third-person syncing and animations I've probably ever seen.
Lastly, he checked how many frames it took to kill and for the opponent's client to register the death.
Now, in terms of killing an opponent, from firing my weapon to the opponent physically dying on the red hit marker, it took 25 video frames for that to occur. But when receiving damage, it took just 19 frames from the first bullet making contact and then firing the weapon to me dying, which is a 27% disparity between time to kill and time to death. So when it feels like that you're shooting your opponent and it takes them ages to die, and it feels like you're dying really quickly, that is how the game is currently operating.
I didn't think the disparity between first shot and visual death would be such a prominent issue between clients, but apparently it is, which is fascinating, but also no wonder people think Call of Duty is modifying damage or manipulating hit registration or other factors during a match. The full video of the Tactical Brits testing is in the description. Now, again, I tried to be fair. I don't think the hit registration issues involve Activision modifying players during a match, but it's important to at least recognize that Activision is okay with and has explored the idea of modifying players during competitive matches. Let's look back at their team-based competitive patent. The modification of the gaming parameters is based on the skill level of each player, and is executed in real time during a gaming session. Therefore, the online multiplayer gaming environment generates a gaming environment within which 2 or more players can play cooperatively as a team, and tailors the experiences to the specific skill level of each player. And to be clear, as a software engineer, I want to debunk the strange notion I've seen in the community that modifying a player's state, like damage reduction or influence in hit registration, can't occur in real time. The simple fact is games are real time. It's incredibly easy to modify a player's state or other factors in the middle of a match. Multiplayer games communicate with servers where anything can be conditionally modified in a line of code. For Black Ops 6's allegedly 60Hz servers, your game communicates with the server code 60 times a second. There's a short video by McWiki who demonstrates what I'm talking about. Again, less than 5,000 views, don't ask me how I find this stuff. The link is in the description, go give the man some support.
But I wrote this one little single line here that will show how like a damage reducer might be applied.
Additionally, we also know that Call of Duty currently modifies certain players with their Ricochet anti-cheat. Ricochet can apply mitigations to detected cheaters or gameplay adjustments to constrain the gameplay experience of verified cheaters, such as cloaking, hiding legitimate players from cheating players, disarm, removing weapons and equipment from cheaters while in game, damage shield, providing legitimate players with a protective barrier against cheaters. Ricochet can adjust movement, connection delay, and input settings, including inverted controls or reassigned keys. It can spawn hallucinations or fake players, which they claim to place near a suspicious player, forcing them to self-identify as a cheater if they engage with the cloned character. They released a white paper on the hallucination system. I'll link that in the description for those interested. So while Ricochet is an anti-cheat and intended only for cheaters, we can at least recognize that since Call of Duty already engages with EOMM to some degree, if they can even just theoretically prove that modifying in-game elements would boost player retention, like they theorize in their patent, they certainly will take that small extra step from what they've already built. However, of course, just like with anything related to manipulating players, it better be undetectable. Lastly, let's talk about accuracy adjustments and hitbox reductions. Out of all of the possible player performance alterations, accuracy and hitboxes are the most probable. It'd be relatively easy to imperceptibly nudge a player's aim or very subtly reduce a hitbox since it's easy to blame the aim assist, player skill, netcode or desync, etc. And it's impossible to verify without playing and feeling the manipulation yourself, though ideally for the game, a player will never feel it. What you're seeing on screen right now is a sample size of players across matches that appear to have aim influenced to some degree. And there's no aim assist since they're PC players. The players may feel like they're staying on target, and so any possible adjustments to the accuracy may feel subtle. However, of course, there's no way to really know, so unless you've experienced it yourself, take this as a potential visual representation and nothing more. I reached out to the person who posted this collection and asked how they know this is player performance alterations and not cheaters using aimbots. They responded with strong anecdotal evidence and logical deductions from their personal experience. Because I noticed this aiming pattern being applied to me on a few occasions and it looked eerily similar to the aim that was afforded to other people in some engagements. One instance I watched in replay was when I was playing Ana and a very competent Genji, Masters, missed multiple point-blank shurikens on my back as I was running in a straight line in a map. I killed him with a lazy Bionade. I knew something was wrong even during the game, which prompted me to investigate how it happened. I suspected that it was some kind of aim resist that was intended to occur in the heat of a large team fight, but the problem was that I was in the far back line away from the action, so it was quite noticeable to me. Some shurikens that grazed me just happened to have selective hit registration and go through me. It would be convincing to the untrained eye. I think the patents of the AAA multiplayer games hoped that people would overlook such minuscule details. This leads me to believe that since I suffer and benefit from the same things, that it might be native to the game and not some epidemic of Discord script kiddies getting their hands on some accessible AI silent aimbot. This could be the reason why legit gamers can be accused of cheating sometimes in AAA games. At moments, the victim can flatter themselves and the next moment become frustrated when the same thing happens to them. Here's another Overwatch 2 example. I'm not saying this proves anything, but it's at least a visual representation for the sake of understanding the potential present and future of advanced EOMM. In the clip, this person starts with precise aim. Then the aim reticle quite harshly glides off the player. Then as the reticle slowly arcs back toward the target, the reticle suddenly and unnaturally jumps. The reticles pattern indicates that of what can be called a protected player, which is exactly as it sounds. Competitive games want new players, or other players at certain times based on their mountains of player data, to have the best experience possible, so it'd be logical to imperceptibly alter a player's accuracy that, ideally for the game, can't be felt, perceived, or verified. Even if the player can feel the alteration, it can only produce anecdotal evidence that no one really takes seriously. He also provides his input hardware setup on screen right now, so it's unlikely to be user error. A top 500 Overwatch player in the pro scene corroborates this finding. I know for 100% fact there is DDA, Dynamic Difficulty Adjustment, after a long enough time analyzing this game since beta of Overwatch 1, not just alone but with a lot of other smart people in this office. People can say things like this are mouse sensor issues. Well, with hand cams and third-party software monitoring the mouse, I've replicated this a number of times in-game, but nothing shows on anything else. This, however, is pretty rare on this tier of extreme case, referencing the video clip I just showed. Normally you will get the enlarged hitbox whilst enemy gets the microscopic hitbox. The pro player then mentions testing the pro scene build of the game used in tournaments and how it's different and doesn't alter aim or hitboxes. Speaking of enlarged and microscopic hitboxes, adjacent to accuracy alterations would be reducing the size of hitboxes. I found a thread of images from a player who compares the hitboxes of Hanzo's arrow against character hurtboxes. There are several examples where the arrow should have landed, even instances where the arrow goes through the head, and this is quite strange and significant because the arrow hitbox is large, and so are the model hurtboxes. There's a wide range where hitboxes intersect and the game doesn't register it. The problem, of course, is it's easy to dismiss this as a netcode or desync issue. As you can tell, this rabbit hole is crazy, but while some evidence seems to be present, at least for accuracy and hitbox alterations, and as interesting as these potential allegations are, all I can really say for sure is that these examples are visual representations of the potential present and future of advanced EOMM. Let's move on. To conclude this brief section on an optimized game's potential desire to manipulate individual player performance to maximize retention, let's go back to the Call of Duty matchmaking white paper. Despite me giving the benefit of the doubt to Call of Duty, the white paper was accompanied by an FAQ where the Call of Duty team basically admits to impacting in-game elements. Does the Call of Duty matchmaking process impact any in-game elements such as hit registration, player visibility, aim assist, damage, etc.? No, our matchmaking process does not impact gameplay elements. Did you notice how strange this question is? It's a non-question. Let me highlight their deception. Do you see it now? In the history of Call of Duty, or any game really, nobody has ever asked if or even thought that the matchmaking process itself impacted in-game elements. The matchmaking process is obviously only responsible for the matchmaking. Their question is nonsense and a clear attempt to deceive and to shut players up by rephrasing the question that the player base forced them to address as damage control. And if that sounds like a stupid plan, I've seen avid Call of Duty players fall for it. Players who have over 6,000 hours in Call of Duty on Steam alone, and their second most played game is Monopoly. I think the intention is very clear on its own, but to hammer the nail in, let me show you their patents and how they're well aware of how the matchmaking process doesn't handle in-game elements. The computer program that executes the gaming environment modifies elements of the session and/or gameplay parameters. And as you can see on screen, it's talking about the same examples that I showed earlier. It's the computer program, that is, the game itself, that can impact in-game elements. Now, if we take a gander at their matchmaking patent, the matchmaking application or process consists of 5 different engines. The scoring engine identifies a potential matching of 2 or more players. The analytics and feedback engine analyzes player and match data to determine whether a given match was good. The pipelining engine may generate 1 or more soft reservations for a player. The microtransaction engine arranges matches to influence game-related purchases. We'll talk more about that soon. And the UI engine provides a match interface used to interact with match information. So clearly these are different systems at play. The Call of Duty team very carefully rephrased a commonly asked question into a question that doesn't address the real question because they can't publicly lie, presumably advised by their lawyers. Think about it like this. If the community is up in arms about you manipulating their experience, such as hit registration, aim assist, damage, hitboxes, and so on, wouldn't you want to fully address the question in a way where there's absolutely no room for doubt? Why would you want to continue to raise suspicion? Genuinely, we have to make the assumption that they can't fully address the true question because they'd be lying. It'd be naive to think otherwise, especially since I completely hammered my point here from 3 directions. Let's go for a 4th direction by establishing that there's a pattern of misleading questions in this FAQ, twisting common player concerns. This one is no surprise, however, since we already have strong evidence of EOMM in Call of Duty, likely since Modern Warfare 2019. Players were concerned that skill was being forsaken in favor of optimizing engagement and player retention, or EOMM. The Call of Duty team, of course, poses the question by redefining engagement from player interest and retention to simply time played, which is a narrow interpretation. Looking back at EA's original paper that invented EOMM and is the basis of modern competitive matchmaking, player engagement can be embodied by many specific metrics, such as time or money spent in the game, the number of matches played within a time window, or churn risk. We can even change the objective function to other core game metrics of interest, such as playtime, retention, or spending. So playtime is considered separate from the core concerns of retention, churn risk, and spending. Specifically, time played might be a surface level part of the community's concerns at best, but it's certainly not the definition that the community has in mind when asking this question. But I'm even being generous here. If you notice, they narrow the definition in order to change the question, but especially the answer, to not be about engagement at all. The answer doesn't talk about player engagement, just whether or not a player's physical playtime is a variable in matchmaking. That's it. There's a 3rd FAQ question, but we'll come back to that. So in a quite hilarious twist, after our brief journey through mid-match element or player alterations without enough clear-cut evidence, Call of Duty themselves all but admit to impacting in-game elements. Which ones? Who knows, but it doesn't matter. Players don't like feeling manipulated and their competitive experience is compromised, no matter what's going on behind the scenes. Though now I'm more likely to believe people that mention how in-game elements or player performance feel tampered with, like the few I'm showing on screen. Although, to be clear, most examples online are still likely netcode issues. We should still be critical and nuanced in our analysis. For our second optimization avenue, we venture back to the matchmaking system itself, or specifically one of EOMM's core game metrics of money spent. Our second avenue is microtransaction-influenced matchmaking. What does this mean? Let's look at Activision's patent titled System and Method for Driving Microtransactions in Multiplayer Video Games. In the abstract, apparently written by a toddler, it's supposed to say something like, the system may include a microtransaction feature that arranges matches to influence game-related purchases. Then it outlines an example. The system may match a more expert/marquee player with a junior player to encourage the junior player to make game-related purchases of items possessed or used by the marquee player. A junior player may wish to emulate the marquee player by obtaining weapons or other items used by the marquee player. The microtransaction engine may identify items offered for sale, identify marquee players that use or possess those items, and match the marquee players with other players who do not use or possess those items. In this manner, the MTX engine may leverage matchmaking to influence purchase decisions. The MTX engine may target players based on their interests. The junior player may wish to become an expert sniper in a game. The MTX engine may match the junior player with a player that is a highly skilled sniper in the game. In this manner, the junior player may be encouraged to make purchases such as a rifle or other item used by the highly skilled sniper. As you can tell so far, none of this lends toward fair, player-centric, skill-based competitive environments. In order to achieve these goals in a matchmaking system, the system has to make major concessions in its integrity and fairness, likely pairing players with large disparities in skill. Now, real quickly, I want to emphasize how the MTX engine manipulates matchmaking through a diagram provided by Activision in the patent. The diagram depicts a process of influence in in-game purchases through targeted matchmaking. An in-game item that may be of interest to a player may be identified. A second user that has purchased or otherwise possesses the in-game item may be identified. Cause a match score between the first and second player to increase, to thereby increase a likelihood or guarantee that the first and second player will be matched. A determination of whether the first player purchased the in-game item may be made. Lastly, respond to the purchase. The first player may be matched to play a second gameplay session in which the in-game item is suitable to be used. For example, if the in-game item is a weapon, the second gameplay session may be selected because the weapon is highly effective in the second gameplay session. Doing so may encourage the first player to make subsequent purchases due to the satisfaction of effectively using the in-game item during the second gameplay session. For an example, let's look at some strong circumstantial evidence for Overwatch 2. Overwatch 2 saw some notable changes from the first game. MMR rankings are now hidden in matches. Queue times for competitive matches have been reduced by a ton. Many players are reporting massive imbalance of player skill in their games. Some players are even asking their teammates what their ranks are and are seeing huge discrepancies. Blizzard has been pushing their new monetization model ruthlessly. New matchmaking system is completely opaque. There's also a seemingly endless stream of matchmaking complaints from Overwatch 2's EOMM implementation, such as this data-driven study. This player measured the skill gap in their matches and came to the conclusion that out of 130 matches, only 9 matches fall under balanced according to their reasonable criteria. A 6.9% chance for skill-based matchmaking. Let that sink in. And the number of people corroborating the unbalanced matchmaking is astounding. However, there's an additional catch. The release of Overwatch 2 was seen by the community as simply a monetization update. Free ways to achieve skins like loot boxes were all but cut, limited to Twitch drops, Overwatch League viewing hours, and having to spend several months playing the game and doing weekly challenges for a single skin. Players could no longer earn event skins through gameplay. And though the Overwatch 2 Battle Pass has a very fair price tag, everything else is absurd, with old legendary skins costing roughly $20 and small cosmetics like weapon charms pricing at $7. Bundles in the store are equally ridiculous, leading to player protests of the costly item shop. The possible monetization models of free-to-play games is its own fascinating future case study. I hope you'll subscribe to go on the journey with me. How Overwatch 2 may have adjusted over time is not relevant to this case study. The takeaway for our purposes is how Overwatch 2 created 2 buckets of players. 1. New lower skilled players with no skins who can't easily earn skins. 2. Veteran higher skilled Overwatch 1 players who own most of the skins via generous loot boxes. So guess what happens when matchmaking cares more about selling skins than competitive integrity, fairness, and skill levels? EOMM type systems are not only trying to hook players through altering match outcome and possibly player performance probabilities, but also trying to pair high-skilled expert or marquee players with and/or against players who don't own the same skins and would be interested in a specific skin, statistically a lower-skilled player. The combined result is an even greater disaster where each desired optimization of an individual player's experience demands a piece of the pie, and each piece decreases both skill relevancy and player agency. For Call of Duty, our evidence for microtransactions affecting matchmaking comes straight from the source, other than their patent, of course. First, their AI generation confirmed that they're actively engaged with the patent. To provide context, by the end of 2023, Activision made an AI-generated cosmetic available for purchase on the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 store. In late January, Microsoft laid off 1,900 Activision, Blizzard, and Xbox employees. Among the teams hit hard were 2D artists. The remaining concept artists were then forced to use AI to aid in their work. Employees have been made to sign up for AI trainings, and its use is being promoted throughout the organization. We started outsourcing lots of 3D art assets, almost all of the art, Noah, the Activision worker, claims, because in-house art couldn't keep up after the layoffs. Some of those third-party concept artists are using AI-generated art as well. And we can see the effect of Activision Blizzard's choices. Art and text has been squeezed out as good enough since 2023 for calling cards, emblems, loading screens, etc. because the mainstream gamer has been okay with supporting slop, so companies like Activision Blizzard respond by producing slop. We vote with our wallets. Skins that can be seen through floors, weapon cosmetics that block sightlines. There's a reason why they removed the feature of testing out skins in the firing range before buying them. Now, if you recall from the patent, a commonly used term is marquee, which represents the expert player which Activision tries to use to influence the impressionable junior player. It's crucial to note here how marquee is a term that's only ever used in this patent and nowhere else within Activision's titles. The phrase marquee player itself is defined in sports as a person who is exceptionally popular or skilled and whose name will attract a lot of people. So it's the perfect term given the context of the patent, and the term has no place elsewhere. Except Activision has been heavily generating content without much attention to revisions or quality. So in the MW2 reboot and Warzone 2's Season 4 announcement, they labeled the bundles as marquee bundles. So they fed their AI the relevant patents that direct their operations and games. Again, marquee is not a term that makes sense to display publicly, and they don't label their bundles marquee in the game or anywhere else. The only exception that I could find was what I can only assume is an obvious AI mistake in the Season 4 blog post. The post screams AI from how it's written, but especially under the Tracer Pack Cyber Riot 2. Now, to bring it back to day 1 of Season 4, hold up! For context, Season 4 began June 14th and the store bundles were available from June 14th as well. The first bundle is a Crash Bandicoot bundle available not June 14th, but June 20th. Then Pro Pack 5 didn't mention a different date, so it was available on June 14th like most of the bundles. So the Cyber Riot 2's awkwardly written description, bringing it back to day 1 of Season 4, confirms that the AI got confused when the second bundle was the one that brought it back to June 14th. To be clear, despite how obvious this is, I'm trying to dispel any possible doubt to make sure we're on the same page, so thanks for bearing with me. The marquee bundle at launch will be Tracer Pack Cyber Riot 2. Oh nice, the Cyber Riot 2 is a marquee bundle, and its marquee item is the Black Hat SMG weapon blueprint. I guess we're selling marquee items now. Anyway, it's clear that their AI spat out the patent a couple times and they stopped caring about fixing mistakes because typical Call of Duty players buy it anyway. The second reason we know Activision is actively engaged with the patent and driving microtransactions through matchmaking is the FAQ. Can you guess what players want to know from Activision and the Call of Duty team? Players want to know if equipping paid items, skins, etc. factor into matchmaking in accordance with Activision's patent. Well, as you can likely guess, they don't answer the real question. Does spending money on Call of Duty content change how players are matched? Money spent does not in any way, shape, or form factor into matchmaking. They carefully specify spending money and the statistic of money spent. And while it's good to know the amount of money spent in the game doesn't affect matchmaking, assuming we can trust their word, this is the third time now that the most prevalent and common concerns from players are ignored. Just like the previous FAQ questions, they know what the subject of the player backlash is. They know exactly what they're doing. Before moving on, we can combine the patents and much of what we've talked about in this video to make another interesting observation. What do we get when we try to mix these systems? EOMM desires to optimize player patterns to hook players, produce the highest retention, and push players to specific states, but it must manufacture a cyclical pattern of highs and lows to achieve the desired control, probabilities, and emotional manipulation. In addition, there's a clear desire to place marquee or expert players who own certain skins with and or against junior players who psychologically becomes much more likely to buy certain shop items. All this, as we've discussed, leads to skill disparities in any given match. We also know both the new and casual player experience is crucial and constitutes more of the player base than high-skilled players. So interestingly, the pressure of the unbalanced skill disparity often falls on the relatively higher skilled players. This is another case where there's a mountain of anecdotal evidence for a team to have a higher skilled player who has to carry the team or else their team loses. I'm bringing back the exclusive Ace to comment on this pattern since he knows the data, has deep expertise and experience with the community, and I can corroborate his words from my personal research into the community.
In every game, it appears they're trying to balance out the average skill rating of both teams, even if that means screwing over a highly skilled solo player by giving them all of the worst players on their team in order to get an overall balance, but then that puts the entire weight of the match on their shoulders. And if they don't match the performances expected out of them based on their skill rating, then they're almost definitely going to lose the game. And the reason I'm not surprised at all, if you play solo and you have good stats, you know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to that. If you are getting too many losses in a row, the algorithm doesn't want you to leave the game and quit and then potentially never return. It wants to keep you hooked and playing the game, and therefore it's going to try really hard to matchmake you in the next match and ensure that you're on the winning team, regardless of what your skill level is. You could be a very low skill player that's a huge anchor to your team, but the system's going to try real hard to make sure that you end up on the winning team, and it will stack you with good teammates to ensure that you do get the win, or at least massively increase the odds that you're going to be winning that next match, and therefore trying to keep your win-loss ratio at least roughly around 1.
Additionally, here's a comment that bluntly explains the sentiment well after they read Call of Duty's matchmaking paper. No one can solo queue team-based modes to carry a group of literal potatoes with raw skill. Nothing in the matchmaking prevents this. If anything, it encourages it. Because if I do lock in and carry the team to a win, the next lobby, predictably, they'll somehow find me even worse teammates that I'm supposed to slay a 6-stack for. By all actual metrics, the matchmaking is designed against anyone even remotely good, and it tries its hardest to force-feed losses like this. I literally won't play team mode solo because of how obnoxiously bad the balancing is. I'd bet hard money that the rage quit numbers are significantly higher because of it too. Certain people on Activision's payroll, who won't be named, have even told me personally how nefarious it is, but it's a decision that came from some dumb suit higher up, and there's nothing they can do about it. Granted, his claim to hear from Activision's payroll can't be verified, but for context, this is expected. Even if NDAs aren't involved, anonymity is common in journalism where people fear losing their jobs or worse, similar to the anonymous source from the Wired investigation of AI in gaming that I showed earlier. And lastly, we arrive at the latest craze, Marvel Rivals. Thankfully, the honeymoon phase is over, so I don't expect the ravenous, close-minded fans who almost always attach themselves to the next popular thing. Regardless, I'm not one to soften the truth. For many years now, you can trust this channel to push past the confusing noise from popular games and to explain the actual design behind them. The Marvel Rivals' studio, NetEase Games, has extensively researched matchmaking and EOMM. I'd even consider them to be on the forefront of manipulative retention-optimized matchmaking research. First, in 2020, OptMatch optimized matchmaking via modeling the high-order interactions on the arena. The goal, as always, is to find the optimal assignments for players to maximize the total utility, and utility refers to a player's satisfaction gained from a match, the reverse of churn risk. But more specifically, the goal was to research and create a more accurate matchmaking system. Precedent literature treated the team as the simple summation or concatenation of its members. The existing work mostly emphasizes the tracking of individual skills. Despite the efforts of depicting individual abilities and mutual interplay, the exploitation of the high-order interactions among the heroes and players is inadequately studied. What does this mean? An individual can be complementary, incompatible, or even suppressive to others because of their abilities difference, competing styles, or social effects. Or in essence, which heroes often win together, which heroes often lose together, and every pairing where heroes have an advantage over another hero. A matchmaking system that considers a game's balance, the heroes on both teams that synergize well or have an advantage over another, theoretically would be a more accurate and fair matchmaking system. It also provides a whole lot more variables to manipulate if they so desire. And then the OptMatch net model takes the players as representations and team up information to predict the match results. Now, context is important, and I tried to provide it whenever possible. As we talked about earlier, to predict the match results isn't inherently bad. It entirely depends on how the predicted match results are used, because predicted match results also opens doors when skill is no longer the only factor when attempting to devise a more guaranteed way to deceptively hook players to keep them playing. But here, for OptMatch, we can reasonably deduce that this model predicts match results in order to create more fair matches, because that's how skill-based matchmaking can operate as well. If we can predict how matches may result given certain skill data, then the matchmaking can be tested with fake data. And if we can also accurately calculate the chance for certain hero matchups to win, then we can more accurately create fair matches. The fairness may deviate slightly given which players are online, the connection quality, and so on, but you get the point.
Let's say just pick every time I saw 75% chance of winning for the better team. I'm going to look at all the times I said 75% and then count up how many times the better team actually won. Say there were 1,000 times I predicted 75%, and out of that 749 times the better team won. That means your system's kind of calibrated pretty well. Matchmakers are complicated systems, so it's pretty good to QA them, to test them, make sure they're working right. And one way to do this is, again, I have a model that I already know is pretty good at predicting. I already know what my player distribution looks like. I can predict outcomes, so make a bunch of fake matches again and matchmake. So put these players in with their skills, matchmake them, and then run the model on them and see if your matchmaking system is working correctly.
In 2024, NetEase published another matchmaking paper. They devised another matchmaking framework called Engagement-Oriented Matchmaking, or InMatch for short. InMatch is the natural next step from OptMatch and embodies the same goal as EOMM. Matchmaking is a core task in esports and online games as it contributes to player engagement and further influences the game's lifecycle. Previous methods focus on creating fair matches at all times. They divide players into different tiers based on skill levels and only select players from the same tier for each game. Though this strategy can ensure fair matchmaking, it is not always good for player engagement. Is game fairness the only critical factor for player engagement? In most matchmaking scenes, the answer is no, which has been demonstrated in EOMM. Estimating player engagement in advance is crucial for establishing the optimization objective of matchmaking. Previous works mostly emphasize win-loss outcomes, which may not be sufficient in scenes with larger player counts. As the number of players in a match increases, the impact of factors such as players' roles within a team and the interaction between players gradually increases. We propose InMatch, which utilizes the latest work in the intersection of neural combinatorial optimization and reinforcement learning. Through this method, the development of matchmaking systems can evolve from fair game to player engagement. InMatch capably addresses the intricate combinatorial optimization challenges that emerge amidst the transition from a fair game model towards an engagement-centric one. NetEase analyzed an undisclosed popular PvP game. In 2017, we saw EA analyze match outcomes and their corresponding churn risk. Here, we see a dataset that's a little different following the analysis made in EOMM. The last 3 match outcomes along with the player's last 3 roles. M stands for main and S stands for support. There are some interesting observations to make with this table. For 3 wins in a row, strictly support players churn at a higher rate. For 3 losses in a row, strictly main players churn at a much higher rate. Notice how much the churn rates vary based on the roles that people play and how the match outcomes affect it. NetEase's takeaway is that diverse win-loss experiences and diverse game roles can lead to higher game engagement of players. Therefore, maximizing player engagement through matchmaking is not a trivial task. The same implications exist for this paper as the original EOMM paper, but taken a step further. Match outcomes and player roles significantly affect player retention, and player retention primarily relies on matchmaking. So based on the goal and the empirical data, the only correct solution is to optimize retention through match outcomes and player roles as much as possible. So not only do they want to influence the match outcomes as much as they think they can get away with, but they want to control which roles you play as depending on the specific match, because your role in a match affects your churn rate. Why do you think Marvel Rivals doesn't have a role queue? A role queue would allow a player to lock in as the role that they want to play as before matchmaking, which means that NetEase cannot fully optimize the player's experience. Now, as a side note, role queue is a separate topic altogether to fully explore, so I won't be addressing anything that's not relevant. But it's important to establish why role queue doesn't exist and what NetEase says about it. For our purposes, just know that role queue allows players to matchmake with their preferred role or roles, and the potential downsides can easily be worked around by the design team. Role queue allows players to play the role they want and also creates more fair matches by preventing obviously impossible or starkly unbalanced role combinations or matchups. But of course, NetEase doesn't want fairness, but engagement. A player's role, or specifically a player's diversity of roles, is a major empirical factor in maximizing retention, to keep players hooked for as long as possible at the cost of fairness and integrity. NetEase also wants more ways to influence matches, such as pairing players together who are likely to play as a weak composition. So NetEase definitely doesn't want role queue. The player base may eventually pressure them enough to add role queue, but they've made it very clear in their in-match paper and also in public statements that they don't want role queue. Marvel Rivals' creative director has stated, "Right now we're not considering a role queue. The team's goal is to offer a wider variety of team composition through team-up skills and their own designs to let people play their Marvel superheroes rather than limiting players to choosing a role. We want people to have a Marvel experience where they're free to select what they want. In our competitive play recently, there are a lot of different compositions emerging from players, and we'd like to continue to monitor these fun compositions and how they impact our game." There's a lot to unpack here, and I don't want to deviate too much from the topic at hand, so forgive me if I don't cover every possible angle or argument. Except I am very passionate about this, so I can't let this statement slide. Team-up abilities actually severely limit emergent and creative compositions. The fact is, it's more difficult for compositions to stray from not only the meta heroes, but now the newly introduced meta team-ups or artificial synergies that suppress emergent creative synergies and therefore reduces depth and theory crafting potential. It can also be said that role queue actually allows players to play their Marvel superheroes of choice, because without role queue, very frequently a player may be forced into a role for the good of the team. Again, NetEase wants this role swapping to occur. They want diverse game roles when it suits the optimization algorithm at the cost of player agency or what the player actually wants to play. And yet, NetEase also actually desires to limit players to choosing a role because they want to push players into either their main role or off role in accordance with their optimization algorithm and empirical data, and they push players into roles through matchmaking and team-ups. If your match is filled with tank mains, or what they call Vanguard, then you're pushed to the duelist or strategist roles instead of your favorite tank role, or the tank hero that you enjoy playing the most. Some players have noticed the role manipulation as well, such as Otter, a high-ranking player who noticed a consistent pattern during consecutive losses.
No matter what I did, the third loss out of the 3 would be completely unwinnable because of players just not playing to their strengths. We got a lot of tank mains on the team during these losses, and people were forced to switch to their off roles, which probably didn't help.
Or it could just be a pattern of bad matchmaking, but I don't know how much clearer it could be that it's intentional. They're not going to invest millions of dollars into a matchmaking research and development department inside their AI lab institution only to not use their own cutting-edge systems that they think are meaningful in the long term. Additionally, if your team would benefit from a certain team-up, you're incentivized to switch heroes or roles to trigger a team-up. It's not guaranteed, of course, but team-ups can provide such large benefits that it's effective at influencing players at the cost of not playing their Marvel superheroes of choice. And of course, it's common for players to bully others for not playing the correct hero, role, or team-up, so the social component is an additional factor, which NetEase is very well aware of according to their own studies. The game's design very clearly runs contrary to what they're trying to trick players into believing. NetEase has said in the past that it doesn't see its roles as traditional compared to other hero shooters like Overwatch, as characters and rivals can do multiple things well. I think this statement is also misleading at best. From NetEase's own research, they require traditional roles for maximum optimization opportunities. If they actually wanted to shake up the competitive space and have characters break traditional roles, they may have experimented with the roles in a substantial way, or really any way, but they didn't. Vanguard's lead teams attract attention, absorb damage, utilize shields, or some combination of the traditional tank role. Strategists, or more widely known as support heroes, are all about sustain, and if you don't have sustain on your team, you lose. And to bring data into this, the most common and successful distribution of roles is 2 of each, followed by 3 strategists in the high ranks and 3 duelists. Given the even distribution of roles, I could go on about how crazy it is for 20 of the game's 37 heroes to be duelists, leaving only 9 vanguards and 8 strategists. Here's a great summary of why a more even distribution of character roles is important. Feel free to pause and read it, then we can move on to my other passionate mini rant. The triple support submeta is predicated on badly designed ultimates that induce virtual invulnerability for their entire teams for extended periods of time, or more specifically, such high levels of healing that only very specific one-shot ultimates like Iron Man can counter. For example, pausing the game until Luna's 12-second ultimate finishes is, unsurprisingly, not fun to engage with and only serves to extend match time from a design perspective. Never mind when Loki copies the ultimate for another 12 seconds, and then Cloak and Dagger's 12-second massive area heal, which can recharge so fast that they can use it roughly once a minute, or twice a minute before it was slightly patched.
It just like boils down to who gets support loot first. And everything after that doesn't really matter because you can't kill anything, right? So if they have Cloak and Dagger or we have Cloak and Dagger rope, we just go in, then they Cloak Dagger themselves, right? That's so stupid. This means that for like 16 seconds, I think that's how long it lasts. Look at this mess. Look at this mess. Nobody can kill anyone. Their Bucky's ulting, nothing, a clone. So now, while we're sitting there chilling and nothing is dying, we have Cloak and Dagger root and we have Loki clone. They Cloak and Dagger root first. Look at this. So now, we Cloak and Dagger. Now there's 2 Cloak and Daggers. They Strange Ult. They can't kill anything. Then they copy. They Cloak and Dagger. Then we Mantis Ult. Stay alive longer. Look at this. Kaiji got his ult. So now we just win. Because they can't kill us. Now we are all immortal. And then Necros, even though he died 50 million times, they can't cap point because they can't kill anything. If you have a Cloak and Dagger, Loki, and Luna, that's almost a minute of immortality. Doesn't it sound insane that you can sit for a minute without dying? Like if you stretch it out, you go Cloak and Dagger, you survive, you live, then you take damage again, 10 seconds pass, Loki clone, Cloak and Dagger route. Yes, and during that time, the first Cloak and Dagger is already at 60% by the time it all ends because she's just DPSing. And then you will get a kill. And if your supports make a mistake and they overlap their roots, you lose the game. There's just so much agency of whether or not your supports actually do their job, because you cannot do much if your supports make this really bad mistake.
NetEase has responded by increasing the energy required for ult across the high healing heroes as a bandage, and I doubt they'll ever truly fix the fundamental problem. The game stops in its tracks for 36 seconds with 3 support heroes, and it occurs every single teamfight. It removes almost all player agency, and it's certainly not fun to deal with. I partially bring this up to disillusioned folks who think Marvel Rivals is an example of the dangerously misleading pseudo-design slogan of everything is overpowered so nothing is overpowered that players got caught up in since the game contains superheroes. I'm planning a separate case study on that, so feel free to subscribe if you're interested in learning more from what I hope is a more nuanced design perspective. However, the main point is, I don't know how NetEase can say with a straight face that they don't see its roles as traditional, or they may be attempting to deceive for all we know, because Marvel Rivals heavily embodies standard archetypes and literally couldn't be more traditional in its roles if it tried.
But I'm really unhappy with the way they've taken the support role, because the support role is genuinely right now just heal botting. It is, you can DPS with some of them, but it's just heal botting so you can get your support ult and then press Q to make everyone immortal.
Both implementing role queue and not having traditional roles would place roadblocks for their retention and match optimization goals. And to be clear, if they add role queue in the future, it matters how they implement role queue. I'd predict something like how League of Legends allows you to choose more than one role to matchmake against, since that would provide NetEase more options to optimize with compared to just one chosen role. And also it would decrease queue times compared to one role. In the OptMatch paper, we can also see the beginnings of NetEase's realization that heroes of different roles are easier to measure with and against one another. We can see that heroes of the same category congregate with each other while heroes of different categories stay distant, which fits our intuitions that those heroes of the same category are designed to be similar, and different categories are designed to suppress one another to some degree. If a hero doesn't behave as its expected roles in the games, its representation vectors will appear in the spots away from its category. This feature helps the diagnosis of the game design. They also see from their data how different players have different preferences of heroes and playstyles, which is to be expected. Back to the in-match paper, NetEase assessed collaboration engagement. They compared fair teams and diversity teams, where diversity teams are composed of 1 high-tier player and 2 low-tier players. If you remember, we just discussed a couple reasons why an EOMM or adjacent system would stack low-skilled players with high-skilled players, to advertise skins and shop items in front of players who don't have them, and to introduce skill disparities that affect match outcome probabilities, such as, but not limited to, giving either a new or fatigued player a higher chance of winning to reduce their churn risk. As shown on screen, NetEase's findings provide a strong indication that players of diverse teams are more likely to establish collaborative relationships, thereby improving in-game engagement. On the other hand, the results also show that ensuring fair games alone is not sufficient to maintain a good player experience, and cross-tier matchmaking is necessary to optimize player engagement. So according to NetEase, the optimal route here is to force higher skill gaps within each team. As long as the empirical data suggests that creating more volatile matches with high skill disparities increases the likelihood of players communicating and becoming more attached to the game, often for the wrong reasons, but attached regardless, then clearly NetEase will implement their findings. Activision has a less toxic but similar idea as outlined in their patent, where they measure likability and can adjust a matchmaking algorithm accordingly. Players are matched with people they've had fun with to nurture gaming friendships. Players match based on subjective variables such as fun or likability, so that habitual play may be encouraged and player retention is increased. A degree of likability between 2 potential team players is used to determine a level of match between them. Predefined keywords or phrases picked up from spoken or typed chats may be an indication of a positive thought or emotion. If a player quit the game in less than a predefined amount of time, one may assume less likability. If the players opt for same or similar music, or music from the same artist or genre to listen to while playing, an increased likability may be assumed. If the players opt to buy same or similar item from the game store, an increased likability may be assumed. These variables can be used to adjust a matchmaking algorithm accordingly. The creepy music spying aside, there are many reasons for AAA games to study and utilize your data to their benefit, such as compromising match integrity to matchmake you with people who you'll get along with and who may influence you to buy the same items. And lastly, for in-match, they tested it against other algorithms. Engagement-oriented algorithms such as OptMatch and GlowMatch resulted in more match sessions for players compared to their fair counterparts, OptMatch Fair and GlowMatch Fair. I'll also show the other test data on screen. And if you noticed, while I tried my best to be fair toward the OptMatch system and the paper, they consider OptMatch engagement-oriented rather than prioritizing fairness. So I suppose NetEase never intended to utilize balance data, such as hero synergies and advantages, for the purposes of improving a fair-oriented matchmaking system. So to summarize thus far, NetEase knows which heroes synergize and which have an advantage in certain matchups. NetEase continues to evolve matchmaking systems from fair game to player engagement, and expands the scope of EOMM's manipulation of match outcomes to include a player's role on a per match basis. And systems such as role queue would hamper their ability to maximize the player's retention. NetEase also tested and embraced evidence of higher skill disparities in order to increase collaboration engagement, as opposed to fair teams of players within the same tier. And altogether, in-match results in the highest engagement compared to other algorithms. Now, here is where I remind you all that even though the psychology behind the systems is empirically true and rational, that doesn't guarantee its effectiveness for the long term, because NetEase's empirical data relies on players not knowing about this type of manipulative system. If it sounds crazy that NetEase publicizes their findings that they shouldn't want players to know about, they do so because they offered to implement their matchmaking system for other studios, and China isn't shy about this stuff. Also, players are never going to find out the details unless someone crazy like me actually invests hundreds of long hours investigating, and even then the majority of players won't discover this case study or may instead watch a surface level investigation or some other video that can easily be interpreted as a conspiracy. I think this commenter summarizes the general player mentality of those who are aware of NetEase's in-match system. What this paper is saying is that to maximize engagement, players should experience diverse roles and skill distributions within their lobbies, because that leads to the least observed churn. So two indirect objectives are, occasionally putting you in lobbies where you may not be able to play your main role, as mix of main and support in one's match history leads to the least churn. The skill gap within a team should be wide, where a theoretical 3-man team should have 1 high-tier player and 2 low-tier players, rather than solving for a fair team where all members on both teams are the same tier. Both of those don't sit well with me. I want to lock in my main role, play with and against very closely skilled players so no one is either turbo feeding or outright 1v9ing, and play some banger nail-biter games. That is fun. What is not fun, but is empirically the highest engagement, is high variance in skill within a lobby and autofilling, which is filling whichever role isn't already taken. I don't want to play with 35% win rate hardstuck players and carry them to the finish line, nor do I want to play against them and bully them for a boring free win. Yes, there's more, and it's juicy. In a GDC presentation, NetEase presents Find the Right Match AI-enhanced matchmaking practice in NetEase games. Predictably, NetEase dedicates a ton of their research to win patterns, which include factors like skills, hero design, composition of heroes, and cooperation. They determine everything that contributes to teams winning, including the compatible/suppressive relationships and strengths and weaknesses, and how many of each role would lead a team to having an advantage over the other. Yes, they know which compositions are compatible and incompatible, which heroes win together, lose together, or defeat another, and they can calculate the value that a role or hero could add to a team on a per match basis. Here they analyze a card game as an example to determine when a match duration is too long or on the threshold of churn. For this card game, they determined that a close but long match should not be a good matchmaking proposal. Remember, a close match is a fair skill-based match. So for this card game, they want to avoid fair long matches as much as possible, whether through unfair long matches or fair short matches. Keep in mind, the only way to reliably matchmake a short match is through an unfair one-sided stomp that ends quickly. Fair close matches are unlikely to end quickly by definition. Obviously, they don't specify how they achieve the end result, but analyzing their intentions and research paints an ugly picture. NetEase can also analyze and discover which win-lose patterns cause higher churn rates and how some patterns cause players to be more sensitive to match duration. Along the bottom lies the win-lose patterns, and the side indicates the churn rate or players who stop playing after a period of time. The lines represent a range of players. The color represents match duration, so when you see red near the bottom of a line, that means longer matches produce less churn, or players quit less when engaging with longer matches. When you see red near the top of a line, that means longer matches produce more churn, so players quit more often. These findings are significant because NetEase knows exactly when players should experience short or long matches in order to hook and retain players, to keep them playing. They also at least admit to giving advantages to the desperate/fatigued players, and while their example shows a tiny advantage, they're obviously not going to show a big advantage in their presentation, and 1% is not going to have the substantial increase in retention that they're looking for. Obviously, if they can get away with diminishing fairness to whatever minor or major degree in order to produce a higher retention rate, it's rational to do so. The bottom line is they measure how much the possible win-lose, roll, match length outcomes are acceptable to players. This is the evolution and transition that NetEase referenced as the goal of their research. While fairness is still a consideration, as it always will at least be a factor in matchmaking, their goal is to address the challenges amidst the transition from a fair game model towards an engagement-centric one, the evolution from fairness to engagement. The main emphasis of previous works was win-loss outcomes, which by itself NetEase found insufficient. Their goals and optimizations do not produce fairness, but reduce fairness, such as optimizing match outcomes and match lengths, and/or diminish a player's wants, such as the inability for a player to play their desired role. And guess what? If NetEase determines that a shorter match will keep you playing, what do you think is the easiest way to achieve that? Either a match with a high enough skill disparity between teams to cause a stomp, and/or a match where players may be forced to play roles they suck at. The method of manipulating match outcome probabilities is the same as EOMM, but extended to more possibilities from a much more advanced system that considers many more variables. And oh boy, the anecdotal evidence is seriously stronger than ever with Marvel Rivals, and most of the time it's data-driven since players can view other players' profiles in their match history. I have played plenty of games with the highest ranks, Global in CSGO, Ascension in Valorant, etc. The only 2 games where I felt the matchmaking is rigged was recent Call of Duty titles and Marvel Rivals. I'm hovering between Grandmaster ranks, and some days you get teammates that are utterly bad and you go on loose streaks, and other days you get it the other way around. It does not feel natural. Not all of the games are challenges. It is either too easy or impossible. I've played tens of thousands of multiplayer matches across other games, League, Dota 2, Counter-Strike, StarCraft 2, chess, and so on, and I definitely feel something is horribly wrong/fixed with this game. The whole system just doesn't make sense in the context of being fair. Top players always start at the bottom without placement matches and are forced to win streak your way to the top. In any other game, you would do placement matches where your MMR would vary wildly to hone in on your true skill faster, so that after 10 placement matches, you might get placed directly into Diamond after winning only 2 games gold or below. So lower level players are much more protected against smurfs and people who are just better coming from Overwatch or whatever. That alone makes me feel like they purposefully want unbalanced matches. No reasonable person would make a system where players who have literally never lost a competitive game are both on the same team against 35% win rate Gold League players. And yes, I saw this as the worst match I've ever seen. It makes no sense either that someone can even be gold with 35% win rate. In fair systems, your MMR would drop until your win rate stabilizes at 50% unless you are the worst player on earth. It is so bad that I cannot imagine a real engineer trying to make it fair, and this is how it turned out by accident. It's maliciously, purposely engineered to be unfair/fixed. Gambling, the randomness and luck, the numbers, reward, if I just play one more, I'll be sure to get it mentality is quite literally the most profitable and exploitative practice ever. Valve does it a lot too. And I mean it caused a lot of teenagers to develop gambling addictions super early. And to a degree, matchmakers that cause win streaks and lose streaks do exactly just that. Players min-max and hyper-optimize the game's meta. Companies are min-maxing and hyper-optimizing their profit margins with as much retention profit as possible. But even then, apparently a lot of them still forget that players are what floats their boat. People who either deny the presence of the brutal EOMM in the game are either terrible players getting carried or straight up ignorant. Same crap happens in discussions about other games. Like, what kind of weirdo do you have to be to think that these companies pour tons of money into certain things just to not use them? I went on an 11-game win streak and ranked plat the other day. I was a shred away from hidden diamond. After that, I went on a 4-game losing streak before I shut the game off. When I looked at the 4 games, every time I had 3 to 4 people on my team with overall win rates and ranked of barely 40%. All of them were on a losing streak of 3+ games before they match made with me. In 3 of the games, I was the only one with a positive kill-death ratio. In 3 of the games, people were toxic on voice chat and text chat after losing the first team fight. The enemy teams, all on win streaks, all with win rates and ranked of 50% or higher. Tell me again that the game doesn't rig things to feed people wins and sacrifice others to do it, especially if they are on win streaks. Every time you can feel when a game is just destined to be bad 1 minute in. Then check the match history and it's always the same. Teammates are low win rate on a losing streak and nobody plays characters that mesh in our team. Enemy is on a winning streak and happen to main exactly what a team needs. Within a few minutes it will be like, oh nice, I'm on the designated winning team this game. Or aw man, what did I do to deserve this? Often you can tell at hero select, like if there's 1 support or 4 locked and no supports yet, then you're going to lose. Even if someone reluctantly swaps to second support, too late. You need 2 people who want to be supports and at least 1 that wants to tank unprompted. I think I've won every game where 2 of each role locked in naturally without discussion. Have never once had a real tight close game that could have gone either way in ranked. And you know he's not fabricating his experience because he says elsewhere that EOMM and in-match are good things since he's aware of the system so he can manipulate it in his favor. Yes, I could see this system being great for narcissists who exploit the machine learning for their benefit at the cost of other players and the continued exploitation of the AAA industry. Additionally, we already know how NetEase is very much aware of each player's preferences and how to manipulate that for role, match outcome, and match length optimizations, so I'm not surprised to see instances where the role select screen can provide hints as to if players are autofilling or not playing to their strengths. And if you remember Otter, in his personal testing, he saw many instances that felt like the odds were stacked against him when his team was filled with tank mains instead of a relatively even balance. I see it in my games where I always check the player profiles. It's not rare for me to come into games where the enemy has Celestial / top 500 players with Grandmasters and Diamonds, whilst my highest team's rank is Grandmaster with Diamonds and Plats. I literally see those games and see the literal freaking ranks. That combined with checking their history. I remember playing against this Black Panther on my winning streak. They were getting freaking steamrolled, but they were a good player. Their team was atrocious though. Next game, I get him on my team. I notice it and bet that it will now be a steamroll against me since he's now on my team. It was. I did try that game, as I would any time, but it was a clear steamroll. I check his history, he had a large winning streak and has lost 2 games prior to the one where I fought against him. That game was also the start of my losing streak. But I do look at my games, the players in them, their ranks and win rates, and the difference between each team. The same with my friends every now and then. I watch a multitude of streamers and they literally also experience winning and losing streaks, where some games they absolutely steamroll and some games seem vastly unwinnable. Look, all I know is that 1 out of every 20-ish games I play actually feels like a well-balanced, even game that is a good solid fight on both sides right until the end. The other 19 games are absolute steamrolls that one side never even stood a chance of coming close to even having a possibility of winning, so something weird is up with the matchmaking for sure. Companies don't develop a complex EOMM system over many years, tweaking it to fit each game they release, then magically abandon it 4 months before releasing their biggest game ever. Especially not for something like skill-based matchmaking, which statistically makes companies less money. Almost every modern game has switched to some form of EOMM, and Marvel's is one of the strongest. I mean, the game uses overpowered characters in its design philosophy. League of Legends does it and it sure is addicting. The whole power fantasy aspect is perfect for retaining players, because when you hit that jackpot of popping off in a game where it didn't feel like an utter steamroll, but was favored for you, that game and the feelings with it get branded into your brain, and you keep queuing over and over hoping to get it again. That, alongside them using fake sales on skins, like how can you not expect them to use a form of EOMM? They already design and use other forms of retention and consumer psychology, plus simply looking through player profiles in your games tends to show pretty evident unfairness. And lastly, their own summation. Within balance, they consider network latency, psychological effects, for example, consecutive defeats, Interpersonal interplay, for example, social relationship, team-up effect. They evaluate players' satisfaction and user engagement through win prediction and churn analysis. And then here is where we arrive at the most obvious implementation of their AI-enhanced engagement-oriented matchmaking system. They assign robots of suitable strength if needed in their games, including Marvel Rivals. Please stick with me because the problem is significantly more meaningful and destructive than you might initially think. How do we know that bots exist in Quick Match? Once you're aware that NetEase deceives you with bots, it's very easy to notice. After 1 or 2 losses, there's a high chance of a bot lobby. The bot lobby is usually 4 human teammates and 2 bot teammates versus 6 bots. You will actually be penalized for leaving a bot lobby, believe it or not. All bots are account level 1, all bot profiles have restricted access, as opposed to limited access for human profiles. The bots are programmed to rush the point immediately. Near the end, the bots will all rush and use their ults whether or not it makes sense. These games have 4 real players and 2 bots on one team, probably to guarantee 2 strategists. These bots always pick the open roles and attempt to go 2-2-2 like the enemy.
Uh-oh.
What did she use her ult on? Were there people there?
I take everything back. This entire team is AI.
Yeah, I'm starting to think that as well.
None of them have any KOs. We've not died. Yeah, no. This entire team is just AI.
Man, if you're trying to hide the fact that you're putting people with the bots, don't make them go 0 kills across the board. What is this?
I didn't even realize they had a Doctor Strange on their team.
Me neither, honestly. Bots also don't have nameplate images, and as you can see, NetEase changes how they present bots over time. The bots here are not all level 1. It's possible that NetEase will increase the difficulty of spotting bots in the future. And of course, NetEase's response is to increase their deception. And the response makes sense because bot lobbies only psychologically work if players aren't aware of them. This is why we broke down the psychology and rationality behind these manipulative, deceptive matchmaking systems. Heavy deception is mandatory to maintain positive player perception. They have also removed the option to view profiles straight from the lobby at the end of the game, have to go into match history now. And lastly, you can know for sure if you're in a bot lobby by checking a site like TrackerGG. It'll tell you who the bots are. Why does Quick Match matter? Why not just play ranked? I shouldn't have to say this, but the way too common attitude that Quick Match doesn't deserve respect, or it's optional, or just go play ranked drives me insane. Dismissive attitudes in defense of games that someone has grown attached to selfishly excuses bad design and diverts attention away from the problem rather than addresses it. Yes, Quick Match is more relaxed compared to ranked. It's also a great place to experiment with a new hero, but Quick Match should still place you in relatively equal skill matches. Quick Match is simply an unranked mode inside a team-based competitive game. And that's how it should work, because if you want to play casually in Quick Match, a competent, unrigged, skill-based matchmaking system will place you in casual matches, so you can have the experience that you desire. Every player should be able to know what they're signing up for and receive a satisfying experience with competitive integrity and fairness. This is just the nature of multiplayer games, period. Here are other reasons why Quick Match is just as important as ranked. Quick Match is useful for warming up before playing ranked, is useful for practicing new characters, is useful for playing in a more relaxed environment without risking your rank. Ranked doesn't permit playing with friends if the friend group's rank disparity is too high. Ranked doesn't permit a group of 5 friends. Ranked doesn't permit crossplay between PC and consoles. And to be clear, these are good limitations. Both modes have a place in competitive games and deserve respect. So, should bots be in any PvP or player versus player game mode, whether Quick Match or ranked? What are the upsides for incorporating bots in strictly PvP modes? For one, the bots increase player retention by slapping in a free win when a player is on a losing streak. This is in accordance with their system that considers churn analysis and psychological effects such as consecutive defeats. NetEase inflates the ego of lower skilled players and kids, not derogatory, many kids are Marvel fans, and tries to forcefully push players to the point where they're hooked so they invest more time and money into the game. And remember, we've talked a lot about machine learning and win-lose patterns, and that continues to be the common denominator behind these systems. And that's the only real upside, if you can call it an upside. Incorporating bots in versus AI modes or in strictly learning modes for new players is a different story. It's extremely important for games to be transparent and for players to know what they're signing up for. But again, this entire system is predicated on players not knowing about it. NetEase is a mobile developer. Bot matches are standard in all PvP mobile games. In every mobile MOBA, you face bots until mid-diamond or that game's equivalent. It's about managing the psychology of casual players and keeping queue times short. If you go on the Wild Rift subreddit, League of Legends mobile game, there's a constant stream of players that can't win against bots and think they're losing to real players, when there's basically no 5v5 full real player teams at all below diamond in that game. It's easier for developers to just do a little sleight of hand, or a lot, since the players who are too casual to discern bots from not bots can't tell the difference. And if winning against covert bots keeps them playing, then that keeps them logging in and potentially buying crap from the store. Developers like this have zero respect for their players. We're just cash cattle to them. Basically, with any mobile game that Tencent has a stake in, it's a good bet that the game uses bots or other deceptive practices. But mobile game design is its own deep rabbit hole, so let's move on to the downsides of covert bot lobbies in PvP modes. And, well, there are a ton of downsides. I'll be showing many players' perspectives to give a good sense for how covert forced bot lobbies affect a game. And many of these downsides are actually multiple downsides stacked into one. I'm sure you'll notice as I walk through them. First downside, volatility and unsustainability in the PC marketplace. I've mentioned this before, but it's worth establishing here. The fundamental property of bot lobbies, or the broader engagement optimized matchmaking systems, is how players cannot be aware of the systems. These systems basically operate off of all or nothing. Even if some of the systems don't exist, like skill-based damage, players are still less likely to play, improve, and invest in the game after learning how companies like Activision, EA, and NetEase have extensively researched, patented, and implemented strategies for optimizing retention via anti-player practices. These systems are volatile and unsustainable because players don't enjoy the knowledge that they're being manipulated. And yet, these companies, like most AAA companies, only care about short-term profits and are also banking on the broader mainstream audience not giving a crap, which is, admittedly, actually quite a safe bet.
Because they know the average consumer is gullible as hell and overly trusting and super loyal to their...
No, they're not gullible as hell or super trusting. They just want game. Bill want game, Bill buy game. That's it. And then you bring out the new trailer. And Bill's like, oh, it's gonna be different this time, I just know it.
And they prey on those sensibilities to make sure that your money ends up in their pocket. And it does. Every single time. Pokemon was busted as hell and still sold 20 million copies. It's like serious gamer Stockholm syndrome.
The second downside, bots are deceptive. They are deliberately designed to behave like real players, doing things like jumping around in the spawn. The devs obviously know that people are not going to be okay with this, or they wouldn't be trying so hard to hide the fact they're bots. Everyone is much too charitable with this. They clearly intend for you to play against bots without knowing it. You'll believe you're playing a competitive game and you're good at it, while in reality it's PvE. The third downside, every bot lobby is 100% meaningless and is a lengthy punishment for losing. Now I don't feel anything from winning any matches because they may as well have been bots, and I will never be impressed with any of the cool plays posted here because they may as well have been against bots. This is what having secret bot matches has done. The novelty dying would matter because after a certain point your dominations become tedium. That's why I think it's actually counterproductive to the player since they're not actually engaging the player in a meaningful way. I think we can all agree the most fun games are the ones where the victories and defeats are well thought. Bot matches will make unwary players believe they're improving, but they'll soon realize the AI isn't anywhere comparable to the real thing, effectively making those bot matches pity wins. Playing bots feels like a waste of time when you know about it. You can't leave the game or you'll be penalized, or you'll immediately get another bot game when you queue back up. To be honest, I feel like being put into a bot match is a punishment for even losing 2 games in a row. Like, okay, I sucked and lost twice. Now on top of the bad feeling of losing, I have to endure a meaningless, mind-bogglingly boring bot game? Jeez. Also, I just got into 2 games as a backfill and lost both in less than 1 minute total. Now I'm back in a bot game. Come on. The fourth downside, the surprisingly incompetent backfilling system punishes players even more. The single worst part of bot lobbies is the gameplay loop of backfilling and bot lobbies. You lose a game, you get a bot match, you get backfilled into a losing game with 20 seconds left, you get a bot match, you get backfilled into a losing game with 3 people on it, you get a bot match. You just wasted 2 hours of your life. The backfills are awful. I literally got put into a match that ended within 3 seconds. I didn't even get time to pick a character. Then the next lobby was against bots. The fifth downside, embeds an improper sense of skill, inflates egos, builds a toxic community. The secretive bots actively stagnate players who then become toxic from a deceptive unawareness of manipulated reality. NetEase grows a toxic community by inflating egos. Why do people quit? When they feel frustrated, when they feel like they're not doing well, when they're not learning anything. No, you start easy, you create positive reinforcements. And then you get a bot match, stomp the bots easily with a 26-0 ratio, think they are now godlike because they did so good, only to get stomped in the next player match. And said match will likely be accompanied by toxic callouts because why would they think they are at fault when they just stomped the last game? Bots give players an improper sense of skill. If I'm testing a character and I don't know I'm playing bots, I'm going to make false assumptions and build bad habits, and not properly learn how to play. And for players who don't know they're playing bots, this causes them to believe they're way better than they really are, which leads to bots hurt the long-term health of the game. To give an example, say a player only picks Duelist. They play poorly and lose a few games. Then they get a bot game. The bots give them a balanced team comp, and they go 25-2 in an easy victory. They think they're improving. If they just had a good team and people willing to play the roles they are unironically refusing to play, they would win like that every time. But the next game isn't a bot game, and they go negative again. But they just went 25-2, so it must be the team's fault. They don't improve or have incentive to learn other roles. Rinse, repeat. I'm using Duelist as an example, but this could easily apply to any role for any player. The issue is that people aren't properly learning the game because the secret bot lobbies keep people from learning, while also making them think they are never the problem. This inherently makes the community more toxic as time goes on. The sixth downside. Remember when we talked about flow? Against forced bot matches, the skill disparity is so astronomically high that players cannot practice or improve against them. Quick match becomes useless for practicing. It's not fun to hold forward left click on bots that couldn't beat a toddler, and it demotivates players from practicing new heroes because they'll inevitably be bad at first, then get bots and get fake practice that at best doesn't teach anything about actual matches, and at worst teaches them incorrectly by giving overconfidence. You can't even practice some heroes properly because of the instant tracking, auto-aim, and irregular movement. You can't even practice against a Storm or Iron Man because they don't move normally. I've been wanting to play more Iron Fist. How am I supposed to get real practice timing my blocks and diving supports like Luna or Mantis when the AI doesn't use their crowd control like a real player would, if at all? Playing literally any of the vanguards and trying to create pressure or space, which you can't simulate versus bots, or holding angles as any DPS. This explains why I feel I've gotten worse at the game. I'm going from steamrolling bots to being utterly steamrolled by players. How are you supposed to improve and practice if you get put against players who may as well be the Avengers, followed by bots who get stuck on terrain? Losing and winning both felt unsatisfying, and now I know why. The 7th downside, there's already a versus AI mode, and it has 3 difficulty settings. So if you want a pity round, there's already a game mode made available for this. There, the bots will actually provide a decent enough challenge to let strugglers learn the fundamentals, and they'll gain confidence for the real thing. Their inclusion is straight up indefensible. There is a whole other mode meant for people to de-stress if they wanted to play with bots. If I wanted to engage in the core gameplay loop of this game, which involves fighting other people, I expect that I should be able to do that. Being thrown what is essentially a pity win is insulting as someone who wants to actually improve and get better at playing. They already have a separate game mode for fighting AI players. If people don't want to play bots, they wouldn't pick versus AI mode. Here's a better idea. If I don't want to play bots, how about I just stop playing this game altogether and not support the developers anymore? Clearly they don't need my support. I could instead be spending my time playing a game that actually respects my time and decisions, and not something that's basically affirmative action for egotistical morons who can't handle losses and need blissful ignorance and a deceptive mechanic to make themselves feel better, because winning in a video game is the only glory they'll ever get in life. The 8th downside, guess what happens if you don't want to partake in a bot lobby? NetEase punishes you because you're trying to break out of their carefully designed system. I shouldn't be penalized for leaving a bot match I didn't sign up for. When I play Quick Match, I expect to play against people. When the game decides it wants to deceive me and put me up against bots, I'm entitled to say no thank you. I should not be getting a leaver message or any penalties. I'd like the choice, not forced into it. You decided that I should play against bots even though I did not sign up for it, so I shouldn't be held accountable for not wanting to take part. I got deserter status today from leaving bot matches. Turns out if you're in bot queue, you'll continue to be until you finish a match. I just wanted a proper warm-up for competitive. The other day in Quick Match, I got an MVP win. 1 loss, then got put in a bot lobby. I've tried closing and reopening the game after 2 losses to prevent it, and it doesn't work. Another time I got 2 losses with 19 hours between them and still got put into a bot lobby. It's supposed to let you de-stress and make you want to keep playing, but if anything it does the opposite, because I know losing twice, or even once sometimes, means a bot lobby punishment, meaning Quick Match has stakes despite being where you're supposed to be able to play for fun or practice. At the end of the day, nobody logs onto the game to play against bots, and if that's all the game was, nobody would play it. So why are we forced to trudge through this? The 9th downside, bots in Quick Match significantly negatively impacts ranked mode. Yes, you heard me right. Now that I learned about it, I feel bad about some of my games. The illusion that I'm not that bad of a player quickly breaks in the next match. Also, to players saying there's a mode that guarantees there are no bots, casual players forced into the ranked games only pollutes the overall pool of ranked players. Next time you see someone in your ranked who just wants to play someone they have no idea how to play, don't complain about it. They just wanted to play with real players. Kind of hollows out the experience. All my wins, I'm like, was it real? I'm starting to obsessively check the other team in Quick Match, and it's driving me towards competitive when I'm just not even in the right headspace. I'll let the creator Spylo explain the extent of how secretive, forced bot matches affect the game from a high-skilled ranked perspective, because I think this is incredibly important, and he explains it very well.
Freaking sucks, man. Freaking sucks. Bot matches are the worst. I had an interaction with bot matches, you guys remember a few weeks ago, in Quick Play, and I wanted to learn Hulk. I wanted to play Thor, and I lost 3 out of 4 games, right? Not terrible, not great. I go into a match and I can immediately smell the bot match. And so I just go AFK. We just full cap easily. They're all AI. We got AI healers on my team. I'm like, I want to learn a new character, but not play them in rank because I'm Grandmaster. And I don't want to learn a character that I can't even roll the queue in a different role. So I want to learn it in Quick Play. But if every second or third game I'm getting a bot match, which is a total steamroll, it's not just the ethical aspect of I didn't sign up to play versus AI. That's already an ethical concern. But I want a competitive game. So you know what it does, chat? Here's the thing. You know what it did? Here's what it did. It encouraged me to, I actually thought about rolling another account so that I could learn a new character. And beating the crap out of bronze players for a little bit, just so that I could learn a new character. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? It actually encouraged me to go off and smurf on an alt, not technically smurf, but create an alt account so that I could actually learn a new character. So you're actively sabotaging not only my enjoyment of quick play, so I don't want to play quick play, but you're encouraging people to get all the Calfs and Smurf so that they can actually learn new characters. I mean, how many streamers have you guys seen right now? And honestly, a lot of streamers will do it anyway because it's good content. It's unethical, but it's good content. But how many streamers right now are constantly creating new accounts, learning new characters? You can't practice in quick play. Insane. And now think about all the poor bronze players in quick play or ranked that are constantly playing versus new accounts because there's no possible way to play in quick play and have fun. I don't want to hear, oh, it's quick play. Shut the frick up. Quick play, there's supposed to be some sort of competitive action. If you take quick play casually, you'll lose a lot of games and you'll be put at an SR or an MMR where you don't have to try and you'll win 50%. That's what we want. That's what quick play doesn't have to be sweaty. If it's not sweaty for you, then you'll find the rank where it's right for you. That's how matchmaking works. But you throw random robot games in there that might as well be playing versus worse than bronze players. That's not competitive integrity. That compromises the quality of not only that action, but encourages bad actors and bad behavior from even well-meaning people. It's an unbelievably stupid decision. It's unethical. The fact that we didn't even know if it was the case for a long time, it's unethical. It compromises the competitive integrity of your game, and it makes the lower portion of the player base suffer. It's terrible. Terrible, 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 terrible.
Overall, there's no excuse for NetEase's frankly deliberate, manipulative, short-sighted, and arguably malicious choice to add covert bots to Quick Match in order to control the experience and increase retention through anti-player strategies. And this decision affects absolutely everyone. There's the seemingly countless downsides in Quick Match itself, the slow exodus of players either quitting the game or moving from Quick Match to Ranked, and the incentivization for mid to high ranked players to create alternative accounts that horribly impact low to mid ranked players. And if you recall from the Call of Duty The Role of Skill in Matchmaking paper, the resultant unbalanced matches causes a feedback loop of low to average skill players continually leaving the game as the average skill of the population rises. Then the new relatively lowest skilled players experience the negative outcomes and the cycle repeats. Indeed, this covert bot lobby problem is a whole lot more meaningful and pervasive than one might initially think. And here we reach the end. If we had more time today, I'd talk about another implementation of NetEase's in-match system. I'll just put some notes on screen about that. Marvel Rivals definitely doesn't employ a ranked system that you want to engage with. However, I promised to briefly show Call of Duty's unhinged response to the desynced hit registration and blood splatter effects, and some fascinating details about the state of Call of Duty's anti-cheat. So if you found the many topics in this video as fascinating as I do, then I promise you won't be disappointed. Additionally, if you stick around, you'll help out the channel by telling YouTube you like the unique stuff that I produce. So thank you very much, I greatly appreciate you. The overall player reaction from AAA companies' desire to maximize player retention is not one of satisfaction or a motivation to improve, but one of frustration at the anti-player practices. EOMM, in-match, or some variation may increase empirical retention and may even feel satisfying when given the exact match you desire in the moment, but if the engagement-oriented matchmaking system isn't tuned to be imperceptible to players, the player base can turn against the game. Something feels wrong, the game isn't transparent, so players fill in the blanks. And in this case, the blanks are driven by extensive public research documents, overwhelming logical deductions and anecdotal evidence, and even data-driven evidence. Overall, you no longer earn your wins, and you no longer deserve your losses, or at least that's how players overwhelmingly feel, and that's all that matters. We can't say for sure how exactly Activision and NetEase manipulate players into matches, but it's clear that they've researched and implemented manipulative practices and players take notice. Players want a fair and transparent matchmaking system and do not want to feel manipulated. People want to play the game. They don't want the game to play them.
It enhances the experience of some people, it compromises the competitive integrity, and it is false advertising in many ways. I want answers. I want communication. I want transparency in this. I'm not going to be hubristic and foolish enough and naive enough to expect that we're going to get it.
If you value this content and channel and the hundreds of hours invested here, please check the description to find out how you can support the channel. Even simply liking or subscribing or watching my future videos help a ton, so sincerely, thank you for valuing these case studies. I also can't do this without my patrons and YouTube members. I'll be commissioning more emojis for the members soon as well, and I'll be streaming more where some VODs will be members only. But I want to make sure you're primarily supporting because you appreciate the unique content. If there are any clarifications or corrections for this video, they'll be in the pinned comment below. Additionally, I'm starting to become an affiliate for services or products that I personally use or value myself, so you may see those as another way to support the channel in the description.
Nice.
Bonus number 1. Call of Duty's anti-cheat is a disaster. For some context, if Ricochet anti-cheat determines that someone is suspicious or a cheater, it will shadow ban the player. When you're shadow banned, you can still play, but only in lobbies with other shadow banned players. Then after maybe a week or so, if they confirmed that you cheated, then you're permanently banned for good. Except, Ricochet shadow bans based on players reporting other players, or otherwise just commonly falsely detecting players. So shadow ban lobbies are also filled with normal players who are stuck in cheater lobbies. And most cheaters become unshadow banned instead of perma-banned because Ricochet only automates checking shadow banned players against what's called detected software, which is essentially just the cheap common cheat software and, in Call of Duty's case, doesn't detect most cheats. From what I can gather, cheat developers recognize that Activision could stop most of these cheats, but they just choose not to. And the type of relatively easy client-side cheats you can get away with is astounding. For example, there's a tool that can kick players from lobbies during matches, and you can even permanently ban people with it, or run malicious code on someone else's computer. And if you get shadow banned from cheating, the game has accessible functions on the client side for unshadow banning yourself. And Call of Duty lied about fixing the problem. It's insane.
I think the reason why that they lied about it saying that it was patched was because they know that you can ban people with it. If you're literally, you don't even need to be in a party. If you're in the game, like say you load into Warzone, I could send something to the server and it would permanently ban your account. And you could make a support ticket, yeah, but they'll just automatically respond back saying, oh no, you've been cheating. So it's fully undetected. I could run around for hours and I won't get banned. Oh. And you can actually, even if you get shadow banned, a lot of people don't know this, but there's actually like functions in the game which can literally just unshadow ban you. Activision could detect all these cheats really easily because they basically, so there's a program called like Face Injector, and they use the driver from the Face Injector, and they basically just map it with like really detected shit. Activision could easily detect like where the memory, because they allocate memory that's just not used by the game, so it's very fucking suspicious. Obviously we don't do that, we have our own like actual kernel driver. Activision could literally step in, but the issue is there's actually insiders in Activision that just help these people for money. Like for example, I've seen people that have made MW3 cheats. They've spent like $7 grand, $6 grand, $5 grand on literally just like code. I've had a ex-Raven employee reach out to me, offered me 12 grand for the MW2 2022 PDB and the MW3 2023 PDB.
He was selling it. He was offering it for sale for 12 grand.
Yes, which we have. If you're in my party on BO6, as long as you're on PC, I can remotely execute any code I want. Like there's some networking that they left in the game, so I can just basically override that because it's still used.
Why do you think they left? Why do you think that's the possibility? You think it's just careless on their behalf?
Because if you take a look at like any of their game, like any of the game's code from like any of the previous, it's just all copy and paste.
So, Ricochet bans normal players and mostly lets cheaters off with a warning, but it gets worse. The Tactical Brit explains the situation very well.
Efficient anti-cheats are very, very good at detecting when something has gone wrong, especially if you look at Valorant and you look at Riot's Vanguard system. There are entire anti-cheat developers who have straight up stopped trying with this game because it doesn't function. From the ground, what it looks like Call of Duty basically has done over the last couple of months has gone, hey, if you're in the top 1% of performers, you're just going to get shadow banned instantly. Now, for those of you who don't know this, a large and vast majority of streamers and comp players have found themselves in a shadow ban cycle recently, many of them who have competed at LAN to a very high level and it's extremely obvious that these players are not cheating in any way, shape, or form. So what's happening in these scenarios is, rather than there actually being any real client-side or server-side detections, the solution for Call of Duty, by the looks of things, has simply just been to shadow ban the vast majority of top performers in the game, and hope that that cleans up the game by the looks of things. And every once in a while, I'll see this shadow ban loop happen, and I'll see a bunch of pros who have all played at LAN tweet out that they have been shadow banned, and the game gets really, really clean because ultimately they've just shadow banned pretty much everybody. It's indiscriminate. They don't care as to whether or not you've actually cheated or done anything wrong. They just mass ban everybody. Their basic solution has just been to shadow ban as many people as humanly possible in order to make the game seem cleaner than it actually is.
Well, the only thing that the anti-cheat does is stop people from raging, and all they do is make them go into the shadows and make it look undetected so their investors don't look like there's cheating, just to please investors. They're not really doing anything to stop it now. These accounts usually last like, I mean, what's crazy is I just keep getting shadow banned and I don't ever get permanent bans.
In Black Ops 6 ranked, the game is an absolute bloodbath. If you haven't been playing ranked play, servers have been going down, and they've been going down seemingly at the whim of cheaters who are able to take them down as soon as they end up losing in a game, because if they crash the server, they don't lose skill rating. And you would think basic DDoS protection would be something involved in Ricochet, you would think it would be part of the server infrastructure, but it isn't. And this morning, I streamed for 6 hours, and in the first hour and a half, we played 4 matches where the first 3 of them were all DDoSed and stopped from finishing.
Bonus number 2, Call of Duty's unhinged response to the hit registration blood splatter issue.
We've identified an issue that could result in an erroneous visual blood effect. So basically those blood splatters that you're seeing, or lack thereof sometimes, when you're clearly hitting an enemy and not getting any damage for it, they've identified that. They're saying those are happening though when damage was not actually dealt while shooting at enemies in all modes. Now, these blood splatter clips have happened with snipers, they've happened with reg guns. It is in situations where a bullet absolutely is making contact with an enemy. They're saying this isn't an issue with our servers, this isn't an issue with the weapons or the gunfights, this is just an issue with the damage not actually being hit there. It's showing a blood splatter for a shot that didn't connect. Even though from that player's POV in live action, it's very clearly connecting. This is not addressing this issue at hand, and in fact, if they go through and they fully fix just simply this, taking away that blood splatter effect, it's going to make it seem now like the hit reg is going to be even worse, because there won't even be a recognition on the enemy when you're landing a shot on them that you clearly are.